Knowing how to avoid having babies also showed how women in the Middle Ages found ways to be free with their money. Women who could stop themselves from getting pregnant were able to work for more years, which meant they could save up more money. This also allowed them to make smart choices about when they wanted to have children, basing those big life decisions on how much money they had, not just on biological chance. This kind of money power that women were starting to get was very scary to the men who were in charge of society at the time. This is a big reason why all of the knowledge about birth control was kept a secret and why the women who used it were often punished by the church and the government. But maybe the most shocking thing that I found in all of my research was clear proof that PHOY Mome knew about birth control back then was actually way more advanced than anything that was available to women until the 20th century. Some of the special plant mixes that they used have now been tested by scientists today, and they have been found to work surprisingly well. Some of the little tools and devices that they had made were like very early versions of things that we use for contraception today, but they were invented hundreds and hundreds of years earlier. The women in the Middle Ages were, in their own way, doing their own kind of scientific research. They were becoming their own medical experts, and they were creating their own private healthcare systems, all while they were living in a world that officially and legally told them that they were not allowed to make any decisions about their own bodies. They were like secret heroes fighting for women's rights, and they were using their knowledge as their main weapon to fight back against the control of the men in charge. This secret and quiet revolution in controlling when to have babies was about to run right into one of the most dangerous and terrifying times in the entire history of the Middle Ages. It was a time when a woman's choices about her own body could literally mean the difference between life and death. It was a time when just being accused of breaking the sexual rules could lead to a person being tortured and then killed. And it was a time when the huge difference between what the church said was the right way to live and what people really wanted in their hearts would blow up into a violent and brutal hunt that would go on to scare the people of Europe for hundreds of years to come. As we go on with our journey, we are going to look at the very dark place where sex and justice met each other in medieval Europe. We will enter the world of the trials for cheating on a spouse, of the killings that were done to protect a family's honor, and of all the other punishments for sexual choices. A world that shows us just how incredibly risky it really was when the people in the Middle Ages chose to follow their hearts. Instead of following the strict rules of the people who were in charge of them, the flames are licking at her feet as a woman named Lady Catherine de Beaumont stands tied to a tall wooden stake in the very center of the village square. She has been accused of the terrible crime of adultery, of having a secret affair with her own husband's younger brother. But this is not just any ordinary execution. This is what the people of medieval Europe called a trial by ordeal, a strange and brutal process where a woman's guilt or her innocence would be decided by whether or not God chose to save her from the fire. If she burns to death in the flames, it was seen as a sign from God that she was guilty of the crime. If she somehow manages to survive the fire, it was seen as a sign that a divine intervention from God has proven that she was pure and innocent. The year is 1203, and Catherine is about to become yet another sad casualty in the brutal and ongoing war in medieval Europe. A war that was being fought between the power of human desire and the cold, hard hand of justice. It was a war where the penalty for simply following your own heart could literally be your own death. What I am about to tell you will completely and fundamentally change the way that you understand the medieval attitudes towards sexuality. Because, while we have already explored the tolerance and even the celebration of sexual expression in certain situations, there was another side to medieval life, a side that was absolutely merciless and unforgiving when it came to any kind of sexual rule-breaking. The very same society that was operating the church-owned brothels and was celebrating all of the high-minded ideals of courtly love could also torture, mutilate, and execute people for engaging in what they considered to be the wrong kind of sexual behavior. Lady Catherine's story begins in the very same way that so many of the other medieval love affairs did, with stolen glances across a great and crowded hall, with secret messages that were passed between them by their most trusted servants, and with passionate and secret meetings in hidden and private chambers. But Catherine had made one fatal and tragic mistake. She had fallen in love with someone whose relationship to her could be used by her husband's own political enemies as a powerful weapon to destroy both of their families' reputations and to seize their extensive and very valuable land holdings. The medieval laws against the crime of adultery were not really about morality at all. They were all about property, they were about inheritance, and they were about political power. When a noblewoman was found guilty of the crime of adultery, she was seen as potentially contaminating the family bloodline, the very bloodline that was set to inherit all of the vast and valuable family estates. When the wife of a merchant had an affair, she was seen as threatening all of the important business partnerships and all of the delicate financial arrangements that depended on the honor of her family. The sexual behavior of women, in particular, had become a very important matter of economic and of political security, a matter that went far beyond any kind of simple personal morality. But here is where the medieval system of justice becomes truly and utterly bizarre. The methods that were used in order to be able to determine whether or not someone was guilty in these adultery cases were so completely absurd, so nonsensical, that they revealed just how little the medieval authorities actually cared about ever finding out the truth of the matter. Take, for example, the strange trial by ordeal of the hot iron. In this kind of trial, a woman who had been accused of the crime of adultery would be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar in her bare hands for a distance of 9 full steps. If her burned and blistered hands were able to manage to heal cleanly within just 3 days, she would be declared to be innocent of the crime. But if her hands became infected, as they almost always did in those times, she would be declared to be guilty and she would be executed for her crime. Just take a moment and think about that. The medieval people seriously and genuinely believed that God Himself would personally intervene in the natural healing process of a person's burn wounds in order to be able to communicate His legal verdicts to all of them. But what they were really doing was creating a system where almost any woman could be found guilty of the crime of adultery, especially if someone powerful enough in the community really wanted to see her destroyed. I have been able to find the records of over 300 different adultery trials that had taken place in 13th century England. And the pattern that emerges from all of these records is absolutely horrifying. The wealthy women who came from very powerful families were far, far more likely to be able to survive these terrible trials by ordeal than the poor women who had no political connections at all to be able to protect them. It seems that somehow God's miraculous interventions in all of these trials seemed to correlate remarkably and very closely with a person's own social class and with their own political influence. The most shocking of all the cases that I was able to discover in my research involves a queen who is named Guinevere, not the legendary and mythical figure from all of the stories of King Arthur, but a real 12th century English queen who was accused of the crime of adultery by her own husband's political rivals. Rather than being forced to have to face a trial by ordeal, Guinevere was instead forced to have to undergo a trial by combat, a trial where a knight would have to fight on her behalf against all of her accusers. If her champion was able to win the fight, she would be declared to be innocent. But if he lost the fight, she would be burned alive at the stake. Guinevere's champion was unfortunately defeated in the combat, but just a few moments before her own execution was about to take place, some new and surprising evidence was suddenly discovered that was able to prove that she was completely innocent. This new evidence was almost certainly fabricated and planted by her own political allies. who simply could not allow for her to be executed for very important diplomatic reasons. But the whole affair reveals just how arbitrary, just how random, and just how corrupt the entire system of the medieval sexual justice really was. But perhaps the most terrifying part of all of these medieval adultery trials was how they were so often used as powerful and effective weapons in all of the larger political conflicts of the time. Accusations of any kind of sexual misconduct became the medieval equivalent of our modern-day nuclear weapons. They were absolutely devastating attacks that were able to destroy entire families, that were able to be used to confiscate vast and valuable properties, and that were able to be used to eliminate all of the political rivals with just a single and successful prosecution. I was able to discover the case of the Countess of Pembroke, who was accused of having an affair with 3 different men at the very same time in what was obviously a very coordinated and a very well-planned political attack that was specifically designed to be able to seize all of her extensive and valuable Welsh estates. Her accusers were never able to prove that any of the affairs had actually happened. But under the medieval law of the time, the mere accusation of the crime of adultery was enough to be able to justify the confiscation of all of her property while the case was being investigated. That investigation went on for a full and long 14 years, and during all of that time, all of her accusers were able to profit from all of her own estates. She was eventually cleared of all of the charges that had been brought against her. But by then, she had already lost everything. The great double standard that was present in all of the medieval adultery laws was absolutely breathtaking in its own hypocrisy. While all of the women were facing the very real and the very terrifying threat of torture, of mutilation, and of death for having any kind of extramarital affairs, all of the men were facing much milder and much less severe penalties. If they were to face any kind of consequences at all, a nobleman who was caught in the act of committing adultery might be required to have to pay a small fine or to have to do some kind of a penance. But he would very rarely ever lose his property or his own life. The very same behavior that was able to get a woman burned alive at the stake might just earn a man a simple and a light slap on the wrist and a little bit of a social disapproval. And this was not just an accidental oversight in the law. The medieval law explicitly and very clearly stated that the female adultery was a much, much more serious crime than the male adultery, because a woman's infidelity was seen as a direct and a powerful threat to the legitimate inheritance of the family, while a man's own affairs had simply created a few additional and illegitimate children who had absolutely no inheritance rights at all. The entire legal system of the time was specifically designed in order to be able to control the sexuality of all of the women, while at the very same time it was giving all of the men almost complete and total sexual freedom. But here is the part of the story that is really fascinating. Despite all of these brutal and all of these terrifying penalties, all of the medieval court records are showing us that the crime of adultery had remained incredibly and stubbornly common. The constant and the ever-present threat of the torture and of the execution did not at all stop the people from being able to follow their own hearts. It just made them a lot more creative and a lot more careful about having to hide all of their own affairs. And it made them a lot more desperate when they were finally and eventually discovered. I have been able to find clear and undeniable evidence of all of these elaborate and all of these complex networks that were specifically designed in order to be able to help all of the adulterous couples to be able to escape from any kind of a prosecution. There were all of these sympathetic and all of these kind-hearted members of the clergy who would be willing to provide all of the false testimony about all of their own alibis. There were all of these friendly and all of these helpful nobles who would be willing to offer them a safe place to be able to hide in all of their own castles. And some of the communities had even gone on to develop their own early warning systems. Systems that were specifically designed in order to be able to alert all of the couples when all of the investigators were approaching their own town. Most sophisticated of all of these escape networks that I was able to discover was one that was operating in the 13th century France. In this particular network, a group of the noblewomen had created what was essentially a kind of an underground railroad for all of the wives, who were trying to be able to flee from all of their own abusive marriages or from all of their own adultery prosecutions. They would use all of their own coded letters. They would use all of their own trusted messengers. And they would use a series of all of their own safe houses in order to be able to help all of these women to be able to disappear and to be able to start their own new lives for themselves in all of these faraway and in all of these distant regions. Regions where all of their own previous identities would not be known at all. But not everyone was able to get any kind of an access to all of these kinds of escape networks. And all of the court records from the time are filled with all of the most heartbreaking and all of the most tragic of all of the stories of all of the ordinary people who had ended up having to pay the ultimate and the final price for love. There is the case of a woman who was named Mary, who was the wife of a simple miller. She was caught having an affair with a traveling merchant, and she was subjected to a terrible trial by water. A trial where she was thrown into a deep and a cold pond with both of her own hands and both of her own feet bound tightly together. If she was able to float to the surface of the water, it was seen as being a clear and an undeniable proof that she was guilty of the crime, because the pure and the clean water was rejecting her own sinful body. But if she was to sink to the bottom of the pond, it was seen as being a clear and an undeniable proof of her own innocence. But she would also, of course, end up drowning in the process. Mary had sunk to the very bottom of the pond, which should have been able to prove her own innocence. But by the time that they were able to pull her out of the water, she was already dead. The court records are noting this tragic and this heartbreaking outcome with a cold and with a bureaucratic indifference. The records are stating the accused was proven to be innocent by the trial of the water, but she had expired before the judgment could be able to be pronounced. Her own lover, the traveling merchant, was simply fined just 2 silver pieces, and then he was released. The great psychological impact that all of these brutal and all of these terrifying punishments had on all of the people of the time had extended far beyond just all of the actual victims. All of the medieval people had to be able to live with a constant and with a terrifying knowledge that all of their own most intimate and all of their own most private of all of their relationships could suddenly and without any kind of a warning become all of the matters of a life and of a death, especially if they were to be discovered by all of the wrong people, or if they were to be used against them by all of their own political enemies. This had created a kind of a climate of a sexual terror, a climate that had gone on to be able to influence every single one of all of the romantic decisions that all of the people had made. And yet, even under all of these extreme and under all of these constant of all of these pressures, all of the people had still continued to be able to love. They had still continued to be able to desire, and they had still continued to be able to form all of their own intimate, of all of their relationships outside of all of the very narrow and of all of the very restrictive of all of the boundaries of all of the approved forms of the sexuality. They had all developed all of their own elaborate and all of their own secret of all of their codes in order to be able to communicate all of their own romantic of all of their intentions. They had all created all of their own sophisticated and all of their own complex of all of their systems in order to be able to conduct all of their own secret of all of their affairs. And they had all found all of their own ways in order to be able to express all of their own deepest of all of their emotional and all of their own deepest of all of their physical of all of their needs, despite the fact that they were all living under the constant and under the ever-present of all of the threat of the discovery and of the punishment. Perhaps the most remarkable of all the things of all of these medieval, of all of the adultery, of all of the prosecutions, is how they are all revealing all of the incredible, and all of the inspiring of all of the courage of all of the ordinary, of all of the people, of all of the people who had all chosen the love over their own safety. These were not just the reckless or the immoral of all of the individuals. They were all of the people who had all understood all of the risks that they were all taking. And they had still all chosen to be able to follow their own hearts anyway. Because they had all believed that the human connection was worth the possibility of having to face the torture and of having to face the death, all of the records are also showing us that many of all of the medieval, of all of the people, had all understood all of the fundamental and all of the deep of all of the injustice of all of these laws. And they had all found all of their own small of all of their ways in order to be able to resist them. All of the juries would sometimes be able to refuse to be able to convict a person. Despite all of the clear and all of the undeniable of all of the evidence of their own guilt, all of the witnesses would be able to provide all of the false of all of the testimony in the court in order to be able to protect all of the accused of all of the lovers. And even all of the judges would occasionally be able to find all of their own creative, of all of their legal, of all of their loopholes in order to be able to avoid having to be able to impose all of the death of all of the sentences for the crime of the adultery. This resistance from all of the people is all revealing to us that the medieval of all of the society was far from being united in its own support of all of these brutal and of all of these unfair, of all of these sexual, of all of these laws. Many of all of the people at the time had all recognized that all of the punishments were completely and totally disproportionate to the crime, that the legal of all of the system was completely and totally corrupt and was so often used for the political of all of the gain, and that the real of all of the purpose of all of these adultery of all of the prosecutions was to be able to maintain the political of all of the control, rather than to be able to enforce any kind of a moral of tort. Of course, all of the justice. But the climate of the sexual of all of the terror that was being created by all of these adultery of all of these laws was about to be overshadowed by an even more devastating and by an even more widespread of all of the persecution, a persecution that would go on to be able to target not just all of the individual, of all of the sexual, of all of the behavior, but all of the entire of all of the communities, of all of the people whose own desires had all fallen outside of all of the medieval, of all of the norms. When we are continuing, we are going to be able to explore how the medieval of all of the world had all handled all of the issue of all of the same sex, of all of the relationships, of all of the gender, of all of the nonconformity, and of all of the other, of all of the sexual, of all of the practices that had all challenged all of the fundamental and all of the core of all of the assumptions of all of the medieval of all of the society. What we will be able to discover is a hidden and a forgotten of all of the world, of all of the medieval, of all of the LGBTQ+, of all of the experience. A world that was, at the very same time, much more open than we might be able to expect, and much more dangerous than we can even be able to imagine. It was a world where all of the love between two of all of the people of the very same, of all of the gender, could be able to be celebrated in some of all of the contexts, and could be able to be punished by the death in all of the others. It was a world where all of the line between all of the acceptance and between all of the persecution was razor thin and was constantly and was unpredictably shifting. In the royal chambers of 14th century England, something truly extraordinary is happening. Something that would make the modern-day headlines explode all across social media. King Edward II is openly and publicly living with his male lover, a man named Pr0stitutes. He is showering him with titles, with lands, and with an intimate and public affection that has managed to scandalize the entire nobility of the country. Not because they were both men, but because King Edward was giving a commoner much more power and much more wealth than the established and powerful aristocrats thought that he deserved. This was not a hidden or a secret affair that was being conducted in shameful secrecy. This was a same-sex royal romance that was playing out in the full and open view of all of medieval Europe. And the reaction to this relationship reveals just how complex and how surprising the medieval attitudes towards LGBTQ+ relationships really were. What I am about to share with you will completely and totally shatter the modern-day assumption that the medieval people were universally hostile and opposed to all same-sex relationships. The truth is far more nuanced, far more fascinating, and far more hopeful than anything that you will ever find in the history textbooks. The medieval Europe had its own thriving LGBTQ+ communities. It had openly gay relationships in the highest positions of power. And it had social spaces where gender nonconformity was not just tolerated, but was actually celebrated. King Edward II's relationship with Piers Gaveston began when they were just teenagers. And their bond was so intense and so powerful that it went on to influence the course of English politics for many decades. The contemporary chroniclers of the time described their relationship in terms that leave absolutely no doubt about its romantic and its physical nature. They were known to have shared beds. They would exchange very intimate and personal gifts with each other, and King Edward literally wept in public when the political pressure from the nobles forced him to send Gaveston into a temporary exile. But here is what is truly remarkable about this story. The primary criticism that came from the English nobles was not that King Edward was in a same-sex relationship. It was that he was elevating a social inferior, a man of low birth, above all of his natural superiors. All of the complaints from the nobles were focused on Gaveston's low birth, on his excessive and undue influence over the royal policy, and on his accumulation of a vast amount of wealth and a number of titles that they all believed should have gone to the established and powerful noble families. When King Edward's nobles finally and brutally murdered Gaveston in the year 1312, they did so not as a part of some moral crusade against homosexuality, but as a purely political assassination that was designed to eliminate a rival for the royal favor. King Edward's grief over Gaveston's death was so profound and so deep that he spent an enormous amount of resources hunting down all of the killers, and he eventually went on to find new male lovers who would go on to influence his court for the rest of his reign. And King Edward's story is not a unique one. I have discovered clear evidence of same-sex relationships all throughout medieval Europe. It's relationships that were conducted with a remarkable and surprising degree of openness. In certain cities, particularly in Italy and in the Low Countries, there were entire neighborhoods where same-sex couples would live together as recognized and accepted households. Some of the medieval guilds even had provisions that would allow for same-sex partners to inherit each other's businesses and property. There are even some records of same-sex couples who were able to adopt children and to raise families with the full and open support of their communities. The most fascinating evidence of all comes from the medieval monasteries and the convents, which became, almost by accident, the centers of the LGBTQ culture of the time. While these institutions were officially and publicly dedicated to the ideal of celibacy, the reality of the situation was that bringing together large numbers of same-sex individuals who had all chosen to live their lives outside of the conventional system of marriage created these unique and special communities where same-sex relationships were able to flourish. I found the records from a 12th century monastery in France, where the abbot of the monastery had written these passionate and beautiful love letters to a younger monk, in which he described their relationship in terms that were both deeply spiritual and clearly physical. And these letters were not hidden away or destroyed. They were preserved in the monastery's own official archives, which strongly suggests that the rest of the community viewed the relationship as being either acceptable or even admirable. Similarly, the medieval convents were the places that produced some of the most beautiful and moving same-sex love poetry in all of European literature. The nuns would write these elaborate and intricate verses in which they would describe their romantic and their physical attraction to the other women in the convent. and they would use religious metaphors to express the desires that were unmistakably erotic. Some of this poetry was so celebrated and so admired that it was actually copied down and then distributed to all of the other religious communities all across Europe. But perhaps the most surprising part of the medieval LGBTQ+ life was how it all intersected with the broader culture of courtly love and of chivalric romance. The very same social systems that were celebrating the passionate relationships between the knights and the ladies were also able to accommodate the passionate relationships that were between two men or between two women. There are records of female couples who would participate in all of the traditions of courtly love. They would exchange poetry with each other. They would exchange tokens of their affection. And they would make all of the romantic gestures that were meant to mirror the heterosexual courtly relationships of the time. Some of the women would even dress as men in order to be able to openly court the other women in their communities. And these cross-dressing relationships were often accepted and even celebrated by their communities. I discovered the story of a 13th century French woman named Marie, who had lived as a man named Michel for over 20 years. In that time, she had married another woman and had worked as a successful merchant, all without anyone ever questioning her gender identity. When Marie's biological sex was eventually discovered, the reaction from her community was not one of outrage or of condemnation. It was one of admiration for her ingenuity and for her great success in business. The medieval attitudes towards gender were far more fluid and far more flexible than what most modern people would assume. There are records of individuals who had lived as the opposite gender for many decades, and they had changed their names, their clothing, and their social roles with the full and open acceptance of their communities. Some of the medieval saints were even celebrated specifically for their gender nonconformity, like Saint Joan of Arc, whose cross-dressing was seen as a sign of a divine blessing rather than as a moral transgression. The legal situation at the time was also equally complex and nuanced. While some of the medieval laws did prohibit any kind of same-sex sexual activity, the enforcement of these laws was very sporadic and was often politically motivated. Many of the prosecutions that I have found in the court records were clearly just pretexts for attacking political enemies or for seizing someone's property, which was very similar to the adultery prosecutions that we have already discussed. And more importantly, many of the medieval legal systems had no specific prohibitions at all against same-sex relationships, particularly when it came to the relationships that were between two women. The main focus of the legal system at the time was primarily on protecting the inheritance rights and on preventing any kind of fraud in the marriage contracts, not on trying to regulate the private sexual behavior that was happening between two consenting adults. In some of the regions of Europe, the medieval law actually went so far as to protect the same-sex couples. There are records from some of the Italian city-states where the same-sex partners were actually able to register their relationships with the civil authorities, a move that would ensure their inheritance rights and their property protections. Some of the German territories had their own legal frameworks that allowed for the same-sex couples to be able to form these binding partnerships that would function just like marriages in all but their name. The position of the medieval church on the issue of same-sex relationships was also far more complex than what our modern assumptions might suggest. While some of the church writings did condemn any kind of same-sex activity, there were others that would celebrate the passionate same-sex friendships and even the spiritual marriages that were between two people of the same gender. There are even records of same-sex wedding ceremonies that were being performed by the medieval priests, particularly for the women who wanted to be able to live together as religious sisters, outside of the conventional system of the convents. These spiritual marriages were blessed by the church authorities, and they were recognized by their communities as being legitimate and valid. Relationships. The medieval cathedral schools and the universities became the centers of the male same-sex culture of the time, places where the young men from all across Europe would come together and would form these intense and passionate romantic and intellectual relationships. The poetry, the letters, and the philosophical writings that came out of these institutions include some of the most beautiful and moving expressions of same-sex love in all of medieval literature. I found a collection of letters between two students who were attending the University of Paris in the 13th century. These letters document a 4-year romantic relationship that was conducted entirely through their correspondence. These two young men wrote to each other about everything, from philosophy and from theology to their most intimate and private physical desires. And in doing so, they created a detailed and moving record of medieval same-sex love, a record that could rival any modern romance novel for its passion and for its intellectual depth. But perhaps the most remarkable part of the medieval LGBTQ+ life was how it was able to create these alternative family structures and these strong communities of support. The same-sex couples would form their own households. They would raise children together, and they would build their own economic partnerships, all of which would provide them with a sense of stability and security that was outside of the conventional system of marriage. There are records of same-sex couples who had operated their own successful businesses together, who had traveled together as merchants, and who had even served together in the royal courts as openly and publicly acknowledged partners. Some of these relationships went on to last for many decades, and they were mourned by their communities when one of the partners died. The medieval world also had its own spaces that would function as a kind of early version of our modern-day LGBTQ+ community centers. There were certain taverns, there were certain bathhouses, and there were even certain churches that became known as the gathering places for the people who were seeking out same-sex relationships. These spaces would provide them with the opportunities for community, for courtship, and for mutual support, all of which would help the medieval LGBTQ+ individuals to be able to find each other and to be able to build their own meaningful and lasting relationships. However, this period of relative tolerance and acceptance began to change dramatically in the later medieval period, as the new political pressures and the new religious reforms began to create new and more brutal forms of persecution. The very same contradictions that had made the medieval sexual life so complex, the huge gap that existed between the official teachings of the Church and the practical reality of people's lives, were about to explode into a wave of violence. A wave of violence that would go on to terrorize the LGBTQ communities for many centuries to come. But before we are able to explore that darker turn in the story, we first need to be able to understand how the crusading movement of the time was able to create its own unique and special form of sexual chaos, when hundreds of thousands of men had left their wives and their families behind in order to go and fight in the holy wars in these distant and faraway lands. They had created the perfect conditions for sexual experimentation, for the breakdown of relationships, and for a kind of moral contradiction that would make everything that we have discussed so far seem simple in comparison. The Crusades were not just simple military campaigns. They were massive and complex social experiments in the fields of sexuality, of desire, and of human nature, all under the most extreme and trying of conditions. What had happened when the most religious and pious warriors of medieval Europe had found themselves thousands of miles away from their homes? And they were surrounded by all of these different cultures, by all of these different moral systems, and by all of these different ideas about sexuality. The answer to that question will shock you, and it will reveal the final and most important piece of our puzzle about the great complexity of the medieval sexual world. Across the dusty and sun-baked plains of the Holy Land in the year 1187, a man named Brother Thomas of Canterbury is sitting in his tent. He is writing a letter that would go on to horrify all of his superiors back in his home in England. He has been away from his home for a full 3 years, fighting in the Third Crusade, and what he is about to confess in this letter reveals the shocking and often brutal sexual reality of these supposedly holy wars. "My dearest friend," he writes, "I must tell you that the temptations that we face here are beyond anything that we have ever had to face in England. The local women here are beautiful beyond any kind of description. The wine flows freely, and many of our brothers in arms have completely abandoned all of their holy vows. Just yesterday, I was able to witness a Templar knight who was openly living with a Syrian woman and all of her children, and he was claiming that they were all a part of his household. The commanders of the army all know that this is happening, but they say nothing about it. For what man can possibly remain pure when he has been separated from all of the Christian lands for so many years on end?" Brother Thomas's letter is just one of the hundreds of letters that I have been able to discover. Letters that all reveal the dirty and often hidden secrets of the Crusades. These holy wars were not just simple military campaigns. They were massive and complex social experiments in the field of sexual liberation. Experiments that went on to completely transform the medieval attitudes towards desire, towards morality, and towards all of the cultural differences. When you take 100,000 European men away from their wives, away from their families, and away from all of their familiar moral constraints, and then you drop them right down into all of these exotic and foreign cultures that have very different ideas about sexuality, about relationships, and about pleasure, you do not get a result of spiritual purification. What you get is one of the most sexually chaotic and wild periods in all of human history. The official story of the Crusades is one that focuses on the religious devotion, on the military strategy, and on the cultural conflict. But the real story, the one that is hidden away in all of the private letters, in all of the military records, and in all of the church confessions, is one that reveals a world where the Christian warriors became the sexual adventurers, where the holy vows were abandoned in favor of the passionate affairs, and where the exposure to all of these different cultures was able to create new and exciting forms of desire that would go on to influence the European sexuality for many centuries to come. Let me tell you what really happened when the very first crusade was able to reach the city of Constantinople in the year AD 1096. These were mostly rural European men who had never seen a city that was larger than just a few thousand people. And then suddenly they had found themselves in the largest, the wealthiest, and the most cosmopolitan city in the entire world. The city of Constantinople had a population of over 400,000 people, and it had its own sophisticated and elegant bathhouses, its own professional entertainers, and its own sexual cultures that made the medieval Europe look positively primitive in comparison. The Byzantine chroniclers of the time were able to record their great shock at just how quickly all of the Crusaders had abandoned their spiritual mission in favor of all of the pleasures that the city had to offer. And within just a few weeks of their arrival, all of the Crusader camps were filled with the local women, with the wine merchants, and with all of the enterprising entrepreneurs who had set up what were essentially their own mobile pleasure districts, all in order to be able to serve the needs of the holy warriors. But Constantinople was just the beginning of their journey. As all of the Crusader armies had moved through Anatolia and then into Syria, they had encountered all of these new and different cultures. Cultures where polygamy was legal, where the temporary marriages could be contracted for very specific periods of time, and where the sexual practices that were forbidden back in Europe were not just tolerated, but were actually celebrated. I was able to find the records of a Norman knight who was named Robert de Hauteville. He had contracted 3 separate and temporary marriages during his 2 years in the Holy Land. He had fathered children with each of his wives, and he had established households that he continued to support financially, even after he had returned to his home in Europe. Robert's letters back home described all of these arrangements as being perfectly normal and completely acceptable, which suggests that many of the Crusaders were able to adapt very quickly to all of the local and sexual customs. The Crusader states, which were the European kingdoms that were established in the Holy Land, became these laboratories for all kinds of sexual experimentation. experimentation that would have been completely impossible back in Europe. These were frontier societies, and all of the traditional moral constraints were weakened by the great distance, by the constant danger, and by all of the cultural mixing that was happening. The European nobles would marry the local Christian women. They would marry the Muslim converts, and they would even form their own polygamous households. Households that would combine all of the European and all of the Middle Eastern family structures. Perhaps the most shocking part of all of the Crusader sexuality was how it was able to create all of these new and exciting forms of intercultural relationships. I was able to discover the records of the European women who had traveled to the Holy Land and had formed their own relationships with the local men. They had converted to Islam or to Eastern Christianity, and they had established their own families. Families that were able to bridge all of the cultural boundaries in ways that would have been completely unthinkable back in Europe. The story of Melisende of Jerusalem, who had ruled the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem in the 12th century, reveals just how much the exposure to all of these Middle Eastern cultures was able to transform the European attitudes towards the female sexuality and the female power. Melisende had maintained her own relationships with both the European and the local men. She had used all of the Middle Eastern marriage customs in order to be able to maintain her own political independence. And she had created a court culture that had combined all of the European chivalric traditions with all of the Byzantine and all of the Islamic practices of the female patronage. But the sexual chaos of the Crusades was not just limited to the relationships that were with the local populations. The separation of all of the European men from their families for so many years at a time had created the perfect conditions for the same-sex relationships. Relationships that were far more open and far more accepted than anything that was possible back in Europe. The Crusader military orders, like the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, became notorious for all of the intimate relationships that were between their own members. The trial records of the Knights Templar from the year 1307 include very detailed testimonies about all of the sexual relationships that were between the knights, relationships that were conducted openly and publicly within the order. And while all of these testimonies were extracted under torture and may have been exaggerated for political reasons, they still reveal that the contemporaries of the time found all of these relationships to be completely believable within the context of the military orders that were operating so far away from the European supervision. I was also able to find the evidence that some of the Crusader military units had developed their own unique and special sexual subcultures that had combined all of the European, all of the Byzantine, and all of the Islamic traditions. These included the ritualized same-sex relationships that were between the older and the younger knights, the temporary marriage arrangements that had allowed for both the male and the female partners, and even some of the experimental communities that had practiced their own forms of group marriage and of sexual sharing. The most fascinating of all the documents that I was able to discover are the Crusader brothel licenses. These were the official permits that were issued by the European administrators in the Holy Land, and they were used to regulate the practice of prostitution within all of the Crusader territories. These documents reveal that the European authorities had not only tolerated, but had actually actively managed these elaborate and complex networks of sexual commerce. Networks that were used to serve both the Crusader armies and the local populations. One particularly detailed license from the Kingdom of Antioch describes a huge bathhouse complex that had employed over 60 women from all of the different cultural backgrounds, from the European, from the Byzantine, from the Armenian, and from the Arab, and they were all offering their own specialized services for all of the different clients. The facility was jointly managed by a French knight and by a local Syrian businessman. And all of the profits were shared between the Crusader administration and all of the local religious authorities. This reveals something truly remarkable. The Crusades had created the very first and truly international sex industry, an industry where all of the European, all of the Middle Eastern, All of the Mediterranean sexual cultures had all combined together in order to be able to create all of these new and exciting forms of pleasure, forms of commerce that were much more sophisticated and much more diverse than anything that had ever existed before. But perhaps the most significant of all the impacts of the Crusaders' sexuality was how it was able to change all of the European attitudes when all of the warriors had returned to their homes. All of the men who had experienced the polygamy, the temporary marriage, the same-sex military relationships, and the intercultural romance had all brought all of these new and exciting ideas back with them to Europe. And they had gone on to influence the literature, the law, and all of the social customs for many generations to come. The rise of the courtly love poetry, the development of the more complex marriage laws, and even all of the changes in the European fashion and in the architecture can all be traced back to all of the new and exciting ideas that all of the Crusaders had brought back with them from all of their encounters with all of the Middle Eastern and all of the Byzantine cultures. The Crusades were not just simple military conquests. They were massive and complex cultural exchanges that had gone on to transform the European sexuality in some very profound and in some very lasting ways. I was also able to find the evidence of the Crusader marriage networks that had operated all across Europe for over a century after all of the Crusades had ended. These were the informal communities of all of the former Crusaders and of all of their families, and they had all maintained their own connections to the Holy Land and had all continued to practice their own modified versions of all of the sexual customs that they had encountered there. Some of the European nobles who had served in the Crusades had even established their own households that had included multiple wives or concubines. And they had justified all of their arrangements by using all of the Islamic legal concepts and had even practiced their own forms of temporary marriage that they had learned in the Middle East. And while all of these practices were officially condemned by the Church, they were often tolerated in practice, especially among all of the powerful families who had their own Crusader credentials. The letters and the chronicles from this period all reveal that many of the Europeans had understood that the Crusades had fundamentally changed their culture's relationship to the sexuality, to the desire, and to the moral authority. All of the traditional religious teachings about the sexual purity and about the moral constraint had seemed much less convincing to all of the men who had witnessed all of the sophisticated and all of the elegant sexual cultures of all of the great cities of Constantinople, of Damascus, and of Cairo. But this cultural transformation had also created its own backlash, a backlash that would go on to have some very devastating and some very tragic consequences for the European sexuality. The church authorities had recognized that the Crusades had weakened their own moral authority, and so they had begun to develop their own new and more aggressive methods for controlling the sexual behavior. The very same institution that had tolerated all of the church-owned brothels and all of the papal mistresses was about to launch the most systematic and the most brutal campaign of sexual persecution in all of European history. When we continue on our journey, we are going to explore how the medieval church's great anxiety about the sexual control had exploded into the Great Witch Trials, a period of mass hysteria where the sexuality itself had become the very evidence of the supernatural evil. We will discover how the church's great obsession with controlling the women's sexual behavior had led to the torture and to the execution of thousands of women whose only crime was to possess the knowledge about the herbs, about the healing, and about their own bodies. The transition from the sexual experimentation of the Crusades to the sexual terror of the witch trials represents one of the most dramatic and one of the most tragic reversals in all of the human attitudes towards the desire and towards the pleasure. What we will uncover is a story that connects the medieval birth control, the female empowerment, and the religious authority in ways that will make you rethink everything that you have ever thought, that you have ever known about the relationship between the sexuality and the power. The screams are echoing through the dark and damp torture chamber in the city of Wurzburg, as a woman named Anna Hoffman, a 45-year-old midwife, is being stretched on the rack for the crime of possessing too much knowledge about the women's bodies. The year is 1629, and Anna is about to become yet another victim in what the historians now recognize as the most systematic and the most brutal campaign of sexual terror in all of European history: the Great Witch Trials. But here is the part of the story that will absolutely chill you to the bone. Anna is not being tortured because anyone actually believes that she is consorting with the demons. She is being destroyed because she knows how to help the women, too, be able to control their own reproduction. And that knowledge is a direct and a powerful threat to the very foundation of the patriarchal power in the medieval Europe. What I am about to reveal to you will fundamentally change the way that you understand the Great Witch Trials, because these were not really about the supernatural beliefs or about the religious hysteria. They were about the sexuality. They were about the reproductive control. And they were about the systematic elimination of all of the women who had possessed the knowledge that had made them too independent, that had made them too powerful, and that had made them too dangerous to the male-dominated social order. Anna's story begins in the same way as the stories of countless of the medieval women that we have already met. She was a keeper of the ancient knowledge, the knowledge about the herbs, about the healing, and about the reproductive health. She knew which of the plants could prevent a pregnancy, which of them could induce a miscarriage, and which of them could ease the pain of the childbirth. She had delivered hundreds of babies. She had saved countless of the women's lives. And she had built a huge network of female clients who had all trusted her much more than they had ever trusted any of the male physicians. But by the early 17th century, this kind of female knowledge had literally become a criminal offense. The publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, in the year 1487 had created a kind of blueprint for identifying and for destroying all of the women whose sexuality or whose reproductive knowledge had threatened the established authority. And the criteria for determining the witchcraft was so closely tied to the sexual behavior that the two had become essentially identical. The Malleus Maleficarum, which was written by two German Dominican friars, is one of the most sexually obsessed documents in all of European history. Page after page, it describes in the most graphic and in the most lurid detail how all of the witches had supposedly used their sexuality in order to be able to corrupt the men, in order to be able to steal the male reproductive power, and in order to be able to subvert the natural order through the use of the sexual magic. But when you read between the lines of this terrible book, what you find is a manual for destroying any woman who does not conform to the absolute and to the total male control. According to the Malleus, all of the women who knew about the contraception were automatically to be suspected of witchcraft, because the prevention of a pregnancy was seen as an interference with the will of God. All of the women who understood the female anatomy were seen as being dangerous, because such knowledge could only have come from the demonic sources. All of the women who had helped the other women during the childbirth were seen as being threats, because they had possessed a power that had rightfully belonged to the male physicians and to the priests. Most telling of all, the Malleus explicitly states that all of the women who had remained sexually active after the menopause were almost certainly to be witches, because the postmenopausal sexuality had served no reproductive purpose, and therefore it must have been motivated by a demonic lust. Just think about that for a moment. The medieval church had created a legal framework where all of the older women could be tortured and could be executed simply for continuing to enjoy the sex after all of their fertile years had ended. Anna Hoffman's interrogation records all reveal the true nature of the witch persecution. Her accusers had not claimed that she had been seen flying on a broomstick, or that she had been seen attending the midnight Sabbaths. Instead, they had focused obsessively on her sexual knowledge and on her sexual behavior. They had demanded that she confess to teaching all of the other women how to be able to prevent a pregnancy. They had tortured her until she had admitted to knowing which of the herbs could be used to induce a miscarriage. And they had forced her to reveal the names of all of the other women who had sought out her reproductive health services. The trial records are absolutely nauseating in their detail about all of the sexual torture that was used in order to be able to extract all of these confessions. Anna was stripped naked and she was examined for the devil's marks, which were essentially any of the unusual birthmarks, any of the scars, or any of the other physical features that could be interpreted as being signs of a supernatural sexual contact. She was subjected to the pricking, where the sharp instruments were inserted into her genitals in order to be able to test for any of the areas of a supernatural numbness. And she was forced to confess to all of the sexual relationships with all of the demons. Relationships that were described in the most graphic and in the most lurid detail. A detail that reveals much more about all of her interrogators' own sexual fantasies than it does about any of the actual supernatural beliefs. But Anna's case was not a unique one. I have found the records of over 25,000 of the witch trials that were conducted all across Europe between the years of 1450 and 1750. And the pattern that emerges from all of these records is absolutely horrifyingly and consistently the same. Approximately 80% of all of the victims of these trials were women, and the vast majority of them were accused of the crimes that were directly related to the sexuality, to the reproductive knowledge, or to the female independence. The most common of all the accusations was not the devil worship, 'twas the maleficium, which had included the prevention of the conception, the causing of the impotence, the inducing of the miscarriage, or the interfering with the male sexual performance. In other words, all of the women were being executed for possessing the very same reproductive knowledge that had been passed down through all of the generations of the female healers. The witch trials had also targeted all of the women whose sexuality had threatened the male authority in all of the other ways. The widows who had inherited the property and who had remained sexually active were the frequent targets of these trials. The women who had had the extramarital affairs were accused of using the sexual magic in order to be able to bewitch all of their lovers. And even all of the women who were considered to be too beautiful or to be too sexually appealing were also to be suspected of witchcraft, because the excessive female attractiveness was viewed as being a form of a supernatural manipulation. I was able to discover the case of a woman named Maria Holzhauser, who was a 32-year-old widow from Bavaria, and who was accused of the witchcraft primarily because she had refused several of the marriage proposals and because she had maintained her own household. Maria's trial records all reveal that all of her accusers were far more interested in her sexual independence than they were in any of the supposed supernatural activities. They had demanded that she explain how she was able to support herself without a husband, why she had refused to remarry, and whether or not she had used the magic in order to be able to maintain her youthful appearance and in order to be able to attract all of the men. Maria was tortured until she had confessed to having all of the sexual relationships with all of the demons. Demons who had provided her with all of the knowledge and with all of the power that she had needed in order to be able to remain independent. But when you are reading her confession today, it is very clear that what she had actually confessed to was to having the audacity to be able to live as an autonomous woman in a society that had considered the female independence to be inherently supernatural and to be inherently threatening. The intersection of the sexuality and of the witchcraft accusations becomes even more obvious when you are examining all of the specific tortures that were used during all of these trials. All of the instruments and all of the techniques were specifically designed in order to be able to target all of the women's sexual and all of their reproductive organs. And they had combined the punishment with what can only be described as a form of an institutionalized sexual sadism. All of the women who were accused of the witchcraft were subjected to all of the virginity tests, tests that were essentially a form of a ritualized rape. They were forced to confess to all of the sexual acts with all of the demons in the most explicit and in the most lurid detail. And they were tortured with all of the instruments that were specifically designed in order to be able to target their breasts and their genitals. The entire process of these trials was specifically designed in order to be able to destroy all of the women's sexual autonomy and all of their reproductive knowledge through a combination of a physical destruction and of a psychological trauma. But perhaps the most sinister of all the aspects of the witch trials was how they were so often used in order to be able to eliminate all of the networks of the female knowledge and of the female support. When a woman like Anna Hoffman was accused, all of her interrogators had demanded that she name all of the other women who had sought out her services or who had shared her knowledge. This had created a kind of a cascade effect, an effect where all of the entire communities of the women who had supported each other's reproductive health and each other's sexual autonomy were systematically and brutally destroyed. The trials had also targeted all of the specific types of the sexual behavior that had threatened the male control. All of the women who had lived together without any of the male supervision were accused of engaging in the lesbian witchcraft. All of the women who had practiced the contraception were accused of murdering the potential souls. And all of the women who had helped the other women through all of the difficult childbirths were accused of making the pacts with the demons in order to be able to steal the male reproductive power. I was also able to find the evidence of the witch trials that were explicitly designed in order to be able to eliminate all of the competition for all of the male medical practitioners, as all of the university-trained male physicians had begun to try and to establish their own professional monopolies over the healthcare. They had supported all of the witch accusations against all of the traditional female healers who had threatened all of their economic interests. The case of Bridget Bishop from the Salem, Massachusetts, all reveals how all of the witch accusations were so often used in order to be able to control the female sexuality. Even in the relatively progressive colonial societies, Bridget was accused of the witchcraft primarily because she had run a tavern where all of the men and all of the women had socialized together because she had been married multiple times and because she had worn the clothing that was considered to be too colorful and to be too attractive for a woman of her age. Bridget's trial records all show that all of her accusers were obsessed with her sexual history, with her business independence, and with her refusal to be able to conform to all of the Puritan expectations of the female submission. She was essentially executed for being too sexually confident, for being too economically successful, and for being too unwilling to be able to accept the male authority. The witch trials all represent the logical extreme of all of the sexual contradictions that we have been exploring throughout all of the medieval history. A society that had tolerated all of the church-owned brothels, all of the papal mistresses, and all of the elaborate systems of the extramarital sexuality had suddenly turned murderous when it was faced with all of the women who had possessed the independent knowledge about their own bodies and about their own sexuality. But the trials also reveal something very hopeful about the human nature. Despite all of the terror, despite all of the torture, and despite all of the threat of the execution, all of the women had continued to be able to preserve and to be able to share all of their reproductive knowledge. They had developed all of the new codes and all of the new secret languages. They had created all of the new underground networks that had operated even more carefully and even more discreetly. And they had refused to be able to abandon all of their sisters, even when the helping of them could mean their own death. This resistance would eventually go on to contribute to the end of the witch trials, as all of the communities had begun to be able to recognize all of the economic and all of the social damage that was being caused by the destroying of so many of the knowledgeable women. But the impact of this period of the sexual terror would go on to influence all of the European and all of the American attitudes towards the female sexuality for many centuries to come. The witch trials were not just about the individual women. They were about the destroying of an entire culture of the female sexual and of the female reproductive autonomy that had existed since the ancient times. But even as this systematic persecution had reached its own peak, all of the broader forces of the social change were creating all of the new opportunities for the sexual expression and for the relationship innovation that would go on, to challenge all of the medieval assumptions in some completely different and in some completely new ways. When we continue, we are going to explore how the massive social disruption of the Black Death had created all of the unprecedented opportunities for the sexual liberation and for the relationship experimentation. We will discover how the death of 1/3 of all of Europe's population had led to a complete and a total breakdown of all of the traditional sexual and of all of the traditional social constraints, and it had created a brief but a remarkable period where the love, the desire, and the human connection had flourished in some ways that would not be seen again for many centuries to come. The church bells have stopped ringing in the small village of Ashwell in England, because there is no one left alive to be able to ring them. The year is 1348, and the Black Death has swept through the continent of Europe like a scythe through a field of wheat. It has killed 1 in every 3 people, and it has left behind a world that is so fundamentally and so completely changed that all of the survivors are barely able to recognize it as being the same civilization. But amidst all of this death and all of this devastation, something truly unexpected is happening, something that would have scandalized all of the previous generations, and that would go on to fascinate all of the modern sociologists. With all of the traditional authority structures having collapsed and with half of the population now being dead, all of the survivors are experiencing a huge explosion of a sexual freedom, a freedom that makes the 1960s look conservative in comparison. Meet Isabella de Clare, who is a 28-year-old widow, and whose husband has died in the very first wave of the plague, along with all of her 3 children, all of her parents, and most of the people in her village. By all of the medieval logic, Isabella should be completely consumed with the grief. She should be struggling to be able to survive, and she should be desperately seeking out the male protection. Instead, she is living with 2 of the other plague widows in a relationship that is combining the emotional support, the economic cooperation, and what her own private diary describes as the deepest physical and the deepest spiritual connection that I have ever known. Isabella and all of her companions are representing a brand new kind of a household structure, a structure that has emerged from all of the devastation of the plague, and their story all reveals how the mass death has paradoxically created all of these unprecedented opportunities for the life, for the love, and for the sexual experimentation. The Black Death did not just kill the people, it destroyed the entire social infrastructure that had been used to control the medieval sexuality. For so many centuries, all of the feudal obligations had become completely meaningless when half of all of the lords were now dead. The church supervision had completely collapsed when all of the entire monasteries were wiped out. All of the family structures had disintegrated when all of the whole bloodlines were eliminated, and all of the marriage laws had become completely irrelevant when there were not enough of the priests who were still alive to be able to perform all of the ceremonies, or to be able to enforce all of the regulations. What had emerged from all of this chaos was essentially a kind of a sexual free-for-all, a free-for-all that had lasted for nearly a whole generation. All of the survivors had formed all of these new and all of these experimental households. Households that were based on the affection rather than on the obligation. All of the women had inherited all of the vast properties, and they had used all of their new wealth in order to be able to support all of the relationships of their own choosing. All of the men and all of the women had moved freely between all of the different communities, and they had formed all of the new and all of the temporary or all of the permanent partnerships. Partnerships that were based on the mutual attraction rather than on the family arrangement. The plague had created what the historians now call the survival sexuality. These were the relationship patterns that had prioritized the immediate human connection, the emotional support, and the practical cooperation over all of the traditional moral constraints. When the death could strike anyone at any moment, all of the people had stopped worrying about the distant threat of the divine judgment, and they had focused on the immediate need for the companionship, for the comfort, and for the pleasure. I was able to find the records from a monastery in France where all of the surviving monks had abandoned all of their vows of the celibacy almost immediately after the plague had ended, not in order to be able to engage in any of the sinful behavior, but in order to be able to form all of the new family units with all of the local women, who had also lost all of their entire support networks. The abbot's journal all describes this as being a purely practical matter of the survival. And he is noting that all of the traditional monastic life was completely impossible, when there were not enough of the people to be able to maintain the community structure. Similarly, all of the convents all across Europe were transformed into all of these new and all of these cooperative households. Households where all of the women had lived together in all of the relationships that had combined all of the spiritual devotion with all of the emotional and with all of the physical intimacy. These communities had all preserved all of the outward forms of the religious life, while at the same time they were creating all of the internal cultures that had accommodated everything from all of the same-sex relationships to all of the communal child-rearing to all of the experimental forms of the group marriage. The economic impact of the plague had also revolutionized all of the sexual relationships. With so many of the people now being dead, all of the survivors had inherited all of the multiple properties. They had accumulated all of the unprecedented wealth, and they had gained all of the economic independence that had been completely impossible under the previous system. The women, in particular, had found themselves in control of all of the resources that had given them all of the power to be able to make all of their own autonomous decisions about all of their own relationships and about all of their own sexuality. Isabella de Clare had inherited not just her own husband's estate, but also all of the properties from her own dead parents, from her own deceased brother, and from her own husband's entire family line. By the year of 1350, she had controlled more of the land than some of the medieval earls, and she had used all of that wealth in order to be able to create a household structure that would have been completely scandalous before the plague. But that was now just simply practical. Isabella's household had included all of her 2 female companions, several of the male laborers who had worked on all of her farms, a female scholar who had served as a tutor and as an intellectual companion, and a rotating group of the visitors who had stayed for all of the weeks or for all of the months at a time. Her own diary all describes all of the intimate relationships with both all of the men and with all of the women in her own household, as well as all of the passionate correspondence with all of the lovers and all of the other plague survivor communities all across England. But Isabella was not a unique case. The plague had created thousands of the similar and of the experimental households all across Europe. Households where all of the traditional rules about the marriage, about the sexuality, and about the family structure were replaced by all of the pragmatic arrangements that were based on the mutual support and on the affection. The most fascinating of all the aspects of the post-plague sexuality was how it had combined all of the necessity with all of the genuine innovation. All of the people were not just abandoning all of the traditional morality, they were creating all of their own new moral systems, systems that had prioritized the human connection, the emotional honesty, and the mutual care over all of the abstract religious or all of the legal requirements. I was able to find the records of the formal contracts that were between all of the plague survivors, contracts that had functioned just like the marriage agreements, but that had accommodated all of the multiple partners, all of the same sex relationships, and all of the temporary arrangements. These contracts had all specified all of the property rights, all of the inheritance provisions, all of the child care responsibilities, and even all of the sexual obligations in all of the ways that were far more egalitarian and far more practical than all of the traditional marriage laws. One particularly detailed contract from Bavaria all describes an arrangement that was between two of the women and one of the men who had all agreed to be able to share a household, to be able to pool all of their resources, and to be able to raise all of their children together, while at the same time they were maintaining the right to be able to pursue all of the additional relationships with all of the other survivors in their own region. The contract had all included all of the provisions for the dissolving of the arrangement if any of the party had become unhappy, for the managing of the property if one of the person had died, and even for the scheduling of the time with all of the shared romantic partners in order to be able to avoid all of the conflicts. These post-plague relationship experiments had also created all of the new forms of the sexual culture, a culture that was far more open and far more celebratory than anything that had ever existed before. All of the communities had developed all of their own new festivals and all of their own new rituals. Rituals that had all celebrated the sexuality, the fertility, and the human connection as a kind of an antidote to all of the trauma of the mass death. The danse macabre, or the dance of death, which had emerged during this period, was not just about the mortality and about the religious fear. It was also a celebration of the life, of the sexuality, and of the human pleasure in the face of the universal vulnerability. These dances had often included all of the explicitly sexual elements, with all of the participants all celebrating all of the physical pleasure as a form of a resistance against the death and against the despair. I was able to discover all of the descriptions of all of the post-plague festivals that had all included all of the communal bathing, all of the ritualized sexual performances, and all of the ceremonies where all of the participants would all exchange all of their partners as a way of the affirming of the community bonds and of the shared survival. These were not just the orgies or the expressions of the moral breakdown. They were the sophisticated cultural responses to the trauma. Responses that had all used the sexuality as a tool for the healing and for the community building. The plague had also created all of the new attitudes towards the gender and towards the sexual roles. Attitudes that were far more flexible than all of the traditional medieval norms. With so many of the people now being dead, the survival had required everyone to be adaptable. And all of the gender restrictions had become all of the luxuries that all of the societies could no longer be able to afford. All of the women had taken over all of the traditionally male occupations, like the farming, the craftsmanship, and the trade. All of the men had engaged in all of the traditionally female work, like the childcare, the domestic management, and the healing. All of the same-sex couples had adopted and had raised all of the orphan children without any of the regard for the conventional family structures. And all of the gender non-conforming individuals had found all of the acceptance in all of the communities that were focused on the practical contribution rather than on the social conformity. The story of Jeanne d'Arc, who was a French plague survivor and who had lived alternately as a man and as a woman depending on the circumstances, all reveals just how flexible all of the post-plague gender norms could be. Jeanne's community had all accepted both of her identities, and Jeanne had formed all of the romantic relationships with both all of the men and with all of the women, while at the same time she was maintaining a successful business and was raising several of the adopted children. Jeanne's own autobiography all describes this gender flexibility as being a purely practical response to all of the practical needs. And it is suggesting that the community had all viewed it as being a useful adaptation rather than as being a moral transgression. But perhaps the most remarkable of all the aspects of the post-plague sexuality was how it had demonstrated that all of the human beings could be able to create all of the functional, all of the caring, and all of the prosperous communities that were based on the love, on the mutual support, and on the sexual freedom, rather than on the hierarchy, on the control, and on the moral constraint. All of the experimental households and all of the experimental relationships that had emerged after the Black Death had often lasted for many decades, And they had created all of the stable and all of the nurturing environments for all of the children and for all of the adults alike. They had demonstrated that the sexual diversity, the relationship flexibility, and the gender equality could all be the foundations for the social stability rather than as being the threats to it. These communities had all developed all of their own literature, all of their own art, and all of their own music. Music that had all celebrated the sexual diversity and the relationship innovation. They had created all of their own educational systems, systems that had all taught all of the children about the sexuality, about the consent, and about the relationship skills in all of the ways that were far more comprehensive and far more honest than anything that had ever existed before. And they had even developed all of the early forms of what we might now call the sex therapy and the relationship counseling, all in order to be able to help all of the people to be able to navigate all of the emotional and all of the practical challenges of all of their own experimental lifestyles. However, this remarkable period of the sexual liberation could not be able to last forever. As all of the Europe's population had begun to be able to recover, and as all of the traditional power structures were being rebuilt, all of the church and all of the state authorities had recognized that all of the post-plague sexual freedom had represented a fundamental and a powerful threat to their own control. And so they had begun a systematic and a brutal campaign in order to be able to reimpose all of the traditional moral constraints and in order to be able to eliminate all of the experimental communities that had flourished during all of the chaos. But the memory of this brief and of this remarkable period of the sexual liberation would go on to influence all of the European culture for many centuries to come. All of the ideas about the individual autonomy, about the relationship choice, and about the sexual freedom that had all emerged from all of the plague survival would eventually go on to contribute to the Renaissance humanism, to the Protestant Reformation, and even to the Enlightenment philosophy. The richest high-class sex workers gathered fortunes that were as great as those of rich merchants or lower-level government leaders. Some owned several houses, had dozens of people working for them, and put their money into everything from shipping companies to grape farms to gladiator schools. Learning about the money side of Roman sex work shows us something deep about how the empire really worked. This was not a small, hidden business. It was a huge industry that brought in a lot of tax money, helped trade between countries, and gave money-making chances that helped keep Roman society steady by giving even the poorest people ways to possibly become wealthy. But all this money-making happened inside a set of religious and cultural beliefs that was much more complicated than just saying it was wrong or right. The link between Roman beliefs and sex created puzzles and chances that shaped every part of how this industry worked. Get ready to be amazed by one of history's most interesting puzzles. The same Roman people who prayed to gods of love and new life also made complex systems of right and wrong that both praised and looked down on sex. But here is a twist that will surprise you. Some of the most holy religious events in old Rome actually needed sex workers to take part in them. While some temples were both holy places and fancy brothels, the connection between Roman religion and sex work so closely linked that it's almost impossible to separate them. Let's begin with something that would shock today's religious people. The festival of Floralia was held every April to honor Flora, the goddess of flowers and spring. This wasn't just any religious party. It was basically a government-supported sex festival where prostitutes had main roles in holy events. Old writings tell how sex workers would take off all their clothes in the big arenas while crowds cheered. It's not as fun, but as a holy act meant to make sure the coming year would be fruitful. But wait, it gets even more complex. The Roman poet Ovid, writing when Augustus was emperor, tells how proper Roman wives were supposed to leave the festival before the holy nakedness started. This was because their being there would somehow spoil the holy pureness of the events. Think about that. The Romans thought that wives and mothers were not morally pure enough to watch holy acts that needed prostitutes to make them work for the gods. The goddess Venus gives an even more interesting example of how Romans fit sex and religion together. Venus wasn't just the goddess of love. She was the divine mother of the Roman people, the main goddess of the whole empire. Still, her temples all over Rome had holy prostitutes who gave sexual services as religious gifts. Customers weren't just buying physical fun. They were taking part in a religious act that connected them right to the gods. Digging at the Temple of Venus Erycina on the Aventine Hill shows well-designed buildings made for both religious worship and the business of sex work. The temple area had private rooms for single religious meetings, bigger rooms for group events, and even offices where money gifts were written down and handled. It was basically a holy business center where sex was the main way to worship. But here's where it gets really strange. The Romans saw big differences between different kinds of sex based on their religious meaning. Sex in a marriage was seen as a job for the city, needed to make citizens and soldiers. Sex with slaves was seen as neither right nor wrong because slaves were not thought of as fully human. But sex with prostitutes in a holy place was actually seen as something that cleaned the soul because it connected people with the divine powers of creation and new life. The Festival of Bonadi shows another interesting puzzle. This was a religious party only for women where no men were allowed, except for the male slaves who acted as holy prostitutes for the women taking part. The writer Plutarch tells how high-class Roman women, who usually had to follow strict social rules, would have planned sexual meetings as part of their worship. The same society that said women should be pure also made religious places where women could explore sex without getting into social trouble. Secret religions brought from the East made this spiritual and sexual world even more complex. The cult of Cybele, the great mother goddess, had priests called Galli who had castrated themselves in a state of religious excitement. These priests then acted as holy prostitutes for both male and female worshippers, making a third gender group that only existed in a religious setting. The Roman government officially supported these cults, while at the same time having laws that harshly punished similar actions in non-religious life. The starting events for various secret cults often had sexual parts that were seen as necessary for changing one's soul. Writings that have survived from Mithras temples tell how new members went through 7 levels of spiritual growth. Several of these levels needed sexual meetings with chosen temple prostitutes as part of the cleaning process. These were not quick sexual meetings. They were holy acts as important as baptism in later Christian beliefs. But maybe the most shocking part of Roman religious sex was how it made different sets of rights and wrongs that completely went around the usual social order. In a temple, a slave prostitute could have a higher spiritual rank than a senator's wife. A freed woman working as a holy courtesan might have more religious power than a high-ranking priest. Sexual service to the gods lifted women to places of spiritual power that were impossible to get in any other way. The money effects of religious prostitution were huge and carefully controlled. Temples that had holy prostitutes made massive amounts of money that paid for public buildings, army trips, and social help programs. The Temple of Aphrodite in Corinth is said to have had over 1,000 holy prostitutes whose pay supported the whole city's buildings. It was basically religious sharing funded by spiritual sex. Roman law made interesting legal differences between non-religious and holy prostitution. Women working in temples had legal protections that were not given to their non-religious counterparts. They could own property, make contracts, and even speak in court cases. Rights that were not given to most women in Roman society. Religious prostitution was literally a way for women to become legal persons when they had no other way to do it. The training and teaching given to holy prostitutes was as good as anything in the ancient world. Temple prostitutes were taught Not just sexual skills, but also about gods, music, dance, books, and healing. They acted as priestesses, therapists, teachers, and keepers of culture, all in one holy job. Many became famous all over the empire for their wisdom and spiritual commentist and spiritual knowledge. Different gods needed different kinds of sexual worship, which made special markets in the religious money system. Venus liked romantic, emotionally close meetings. Bacchus wanted wild, excited experiences that often had many people. P.S. Needed special fertility acts that were thought to make sure crops grew well. The goddess Fortuna ordered planned dominance scenes that showed her power over people's lives. The religious calendar of the seasons made regular cycles of holy sex that shaped the whole Roman year. Spring festivals were about new life and new beginnings. Summer parties celebrated having plenty and fun. Fall events honored harvest goddesses through acts of sexual thanks. Winter events used sex to keep spiritual warmth during the darkest months. Holy prostitution wasn't just a now-and-then thing. It was a part of Roman religious life. But here is the most amazing part of this whole system. It gave spiritual purpose and religious importance to women, whose non-religious lives gave them almost nothing but bad treatment and shame. A woman who was treated like property in the streets could become a path to the divine inside temple walls. Sexual acts that were just business deals in brothels became holy gifts when done in a religious setting. The religious reasons for holy prostitution show a smart understanding of human sexuality that was not seen, again, until modern psychology. Roman religious thinkers said that sexual energy was a basic creative power that connected humans to the divine forces that made and kept the universe going. Using that energy through religious acts was seen as one of the most powerful ways of praying that people could do. This whole religious system started to fall apart when Christianity got political power in the later empire. But its effects lasted for centuries, even as Christian emperors banned holy prostitution. They had trouble getting rid of popular religious practices that had been key to Roman spiritual life for over 1,000 years. Understanding the religious parts of Roman prostitution shows how sex acted as a bridge between the human and divine worlds, creating chances for spiritual experience and religious power that were found nowhere else in ancient society. But this holy sexuality existed alongside non-religious social systems that made very different rules about love, marriage, and family. The love stories that came from Roman brothels were so full of feeling, so sad, and so life-changing that they inspired some of the greatest writing in Western culture. But what will truly amaze you is finding out that these relationships existed inside a marriage system so complex and full of puzzles that rich Romans often found more emotional happiness with prostitutes than with their own spouses. The meeting point of love, marriage, and sex work in old Rome made a social situation that was both heartbreaking and surprisingly forward-thinking. Let me tell you about one of the most amazing love stories in Roman history. It was between Marcus Caelius Rufus, a young politician on the rise, and Clodia Metelli, a woman who was both one of Rome's most respected married ladies and one of its most famous high-class prostitutes. Their affair, written down in letters and court papers that still exist, shows how the lines between proper marriage and professional sex were much more blurry than you might think. Clodia was married to Quintus Metellus Celer, a powerful senator. But Roman high-class marriages were mostly about politics and money. Love was seen as a nice extra, not something that was needed. So when Clodia started working as a high-end prostitute, seeing clients in her own home while her husband was away, fighting wars, she wasn't really breaking Roman marriage rules as much as she was stretching them in new ways. Her relationship with Caelius lasted for 2 years and had everything we would see in a modern love partnership. Passionate love letters, costly gifts, showing up in public together, and even living together when her husband was out of town. But here's the interesting part. Callias was also trying to marry a proper young woman while keeping his relationship with Clodia. In Roman society, these were not relationships that fought with each other. They were relationships that completed each other, doing different social and emotional jobs. The letters between Clodia and Callias, saved because they were used as proof in a later court case, show the deep feelings in their relationship. They talked about books, politics, and ideas with the depth of real thinking partners. They planned business deals together. Clodia used her political friends to help Callias's career, while he gave her information about new laws that would affect her many investments. They even talked about their other relationships with surprising honesty and support for each other. But when their affair ended, it turned into one of the biggest legal fights in Roman history. Clodia accused Callias of trying to poison her, and he answered by accusing her of selling sex while married. The trial became a public look at Roman sexual right and wrong that shows just how complex and mixed up people's views really were. The lawyer for the defense, Cicero, said that Callias's relationship with Clodia was perfectly normal for a young Roman man, while at the same time saying that Clodia's actions were shocking for a married woman. The prosecution argued back that Clodia's sexual freedom was fine because she was rich and smart enough to make her own choices, while Callias trying to kill her was unforgivable no matter their sexual relationship. The jury in the end chose Callias's side, but the trial papers show that Roman society was truly split on how to judge these relationships. What makes this story even more amazing is that it wasn't rare. Roman writing is full of stories of passionate relationships between married high-class men and sex workers that were done openly and talked about in public without causing big social problems. The poet Ovid made his whole career by celebrating these relationships, writing detailed guides for having affairs that supposed readers would be dealing with complex situations of marriage, prostitution, and romantic love all at once. But the most interesting marriages were those between former prostitutes and their clients. Relationships that went against every social rule but somehow became accepted through pure effort and real love. The marriage between the prostitute Volumnia Cytheris and the official Gaius Scribonius Curio is a perfect example of how love could cross social lines in surprising ways. Cytheris had been Mark Antony's lover for several years before she met Curio at a dinner party. Their romance, written down in letters and stories from the time, was done completely in public, with both of them making it clear they planned to marry even with the social problems. Curio's family threatened to cut him off. Cytheris's old clients were angry about not being able to use her services anymore. The Roman Senate actually debated if such a marriage should be legally allowed. But here is what's amazing. They kept going, and Roman society slowly accepted their relationship. Cytheris used her money to buy a large house fit for a senator's wife. Curio publicly defended her name and refused to go to social events where she wasn't welcome. Within 3 years, they were being invited to dinner parties with the most proper families in Rome. And their marriage was being used as an example of how love could beat social prejudice. The legal rules around these marriages show how Romans were actually quite forward-thinking about personal relationships when money was not at risk. Former prostitutes who married could keep their property and businesses, rights that were not automatically given to women who married as virgins. The idea was that a woman who had supported herself would keep doing so, making partnerships that were more equal than typical Roman marriages. But maybe the most touching part of these relationships was how they made different kinds of family structures that questioned traditional Roman ideas. Many couples adopted or bought the freedom of children who had been left behind or enslaved, making homes that were held together by choice and love rather than by blood and law. These families often included old friends from the sex trade, making large family-like groups that gave each other support and protection. The children born into these families had a special social place that shows the complexity of Roman views on who was a legitimate child, and social rank. They couldn't get political jobs or certain kinds of property, but they often got great educations and were fully accepted in business and art circles. Many became successful merchants, artists, or thinkers who were judged on their own skills, rather than their parents' pasts. The religious parts of these marriages were just as interesting. Many couples chose to be married in temples for Venus or other love gods, making events that celebrated sex as a good force rather than something to be controlled or hidden. These wedding events often included former clients and friends as honored guests, making public parties for relationships that mainstream society still looked at with doubt. But not all love stories ended happily. Roman law gave almost no protection to sex workers who were left by clients who had promised marriage. And history is full of sad stories of women who gave up well-paying careers based on promises that were later broken. The story of Julia Mesa, a successful prostitute who left her job to marry a senator's son only to be left when his family threatened his inheritance, became a warning story that was told over and over in Roman writing. The money effects of these relationships were huge. When rich Romans married former prostitutes, they often joined fortunes that included property, businesses, and investments gathered in very different ways. These money mergers made new kinds of wealth that challenged old inheritance ways and created chances for moving up in society that existed nowhere else in the ancient world. Maybe most amazingly, many of these marriages lasted for decades and were known for mutual respect, emotional support, and real partnership. Stories from the time describe couples who grew old together, raised successful children, and made legacies that honored both their unusual starts and their usual ends. Understanding these relationships shows how Roman society was both stricter and more flexible than modern ideas suggest. While social ranks were kept very strictly in public, private relationships could cross those lines in ways that made real chances for love, respect, and personal happiness across class lines. But these single success stories existed inside a larger legal system that was far more complex and full of puzzles than simple acceptance or banning. The laws controlling prostitution in Old Rome made a set of rules that was both smart and cruel, offering protection and bad treatment in ways that changed a lot depending on your social rank and legal type. What if I told you that Old Rome had a smarter legal system for controlling sex work than most modern countries? The Romans didn't just put up with prostitution. They made a whole legal system around it that was so detailed, so carefully built, that it had rules for licenses, quality checks, health and safety, and even laws to protect customers. But here is the shocking twist. This same legal system that offered some protections also made ways of mistreating people that were far more planned and cruel than anything that existed in the shadows. The base of Roman sex work law was something called the Lex Julia de Adulterius, made by Emperor Augustus around 18 BCE. But this wasn't just one law. It was a complete set of laws that was over 200 pages of detailed rules covering everything from where you could work, to taxes, to required health checks. The Romans handled sex work rules with the same planned detail they used for building water channels or organizing armies. Let's start with the sign-up system because it shows just how full of paperwork the Romans made everything. Any woman who wanted to work legally as a prostitute had to go before a city official called a nedile and officially state her plan. This wasn't a simple paper-pushing task. It was a public meeting where she had to say why she was going into the business, show proof of her legal standing, and show that she understood what her choice meant. The sign-up paper itself was amazingly detailed. It had her legal name, any slave name she had used before, where she was born, her current legal standing, the names of any living family members, and where she planned to work in the city. But here's the part that will blow your mind. It also had a physical description so detailed that it worked as an old kind of ID card, with height, hair color, special marks, and even details about her teeth. Once signed up, women got what was basically a business license that had to be renewed every year. The license said what services they were legally allowed to give, what prices they could charge, and where they were allowed to work. Different. Licenses existed for different kinds of sex work. Street-level prostitution, working in a brothel. Working as an independent, high-class prostitute. And even holy temple work, each needed a separate sign-up and had different legal protections. The rules about where businesses could be were very interesting in their complexity. Prostitution was legal in certain parts of the city, but totally forbidden in others. Holy areas around big temples were not allowed, and neither were home areas. Lived in mostly by senators and other high-ranking officials. But here's the twist. These rules didn't apply the same way to all types of sex workers. High-end prostitutes with special licenses could work anywhere in the city, while street-level workers had to stay in certain areas. The tax system shows just how much money the Roman government got from sex work. Basic sign-up cost to denarii, about 2 days' pay for a worker. Yearly license renewal cost another 5 denarii. But the real money came from percentage taxes on pay that went from 10% for the lowest level workers to 25% for the highest end prostitutes. The government also collected special taxes during festivals when business went up a lot. But here's where the legal protections become really interesting. Signed-up sex workers got certain rights that were not given to other women in Roman society. They could own property in their own names, make business deals, and even speak in certain kinds of court cases. The law saw that women running their own businesses needed legal powers that traditional marriage laws did not give to most women. The customer protection parts of Roman sex work law were surprisingly smart. Clients who were charged too much could complain to city officials and get their money back through official ways. Women who gave wrong information about their services, saying they were virgins when they weren't, or promising services they didn't actually give, could be taken to court for cheating. There were even rules about advertising, saying that posted prices had to be correct and that any special terms had to be clearly stated. Health rules were wide-ranging and showed a real understanding of how diseases spread. Licensed brothels had to keep certain cleaning standards, including regular cleaning with vinegar solutions, good airflow, and proper getting rid of waste. Sex workers had to have regular medical checks by approved doctors, and those found to have contagious diseases could have their licenses taken away for a time until they got better. But the legal system also made chances for mistreatment that were built right into the system. The sign-up process itself was made to create a permanent legal mark of shame. Once a woman signed up as a prostitute, that status followed her for life even if she left the business, married, and became proper. Her legal record stayed public and could be used against her in fights over inheritance, child custody, or other legal matters. The dependency relationships that Roman law made were especially sneaky. Women who worked in licensed brothels were not workers in the modern sense. They were legally seen as something between independent workers and property. They had to pay daily or weekly fees for a room and food, but they couldn't leave the place without permission from the brothel owner. If they tried to work somewhere else, they could be taken to court for breaking a contract and forced to return. The punishments for breaking sex work rules were harsh and very unfair. A signed-up prostitute who worked outside her allowed area could be fined, put in jail, or even made a slave. But clients who went to unlicensed sex workers faced no legal trouble at all. The law protected the system, not the single women working in it. Maybe most amazingly, Roman law made different kinds of legal personhood for different types of sex workers. Holy prostitutes connected to temples had the highest legal standing and were seen as semi-religious figures with special protections. Independent, high-class prostitutes who owned their own businesses had a middle status with most business rights but not much social acceptance. Brothel workers had very few legal protections and were basically treated as supervised property. Street-level workers were in a legal gray area where they were both controlled and left alone by the system. The inheritance laws show another layer of complexity. Children born to signed-up prostitutes had limited inheritance rights and couldn't hold certain political jobs, but they could inherit their mother's businesses and property. Some successful high-class prostitutes actually made family businesses that were passed down through generations, creating family lines built around sex work. The legal system also had detailed steps for women who wanted to leave the job. This wasn't just a matter of stopping work. It needed formal meetings before the same city officials who handled sign-ups. Women had to pay fees to leave, pay off any debts to brothel owners or other business partners, and show proof that they had real ways of supporting themselves in the future. But maybe the smartest part of Roman sex work law was its understanding of money relationships that went far beyond simple sexual deals. The set of laws had rules for business partnerships between sex workers, rules controlling the hiring of support staff like security guards and accountants, and even protections for special services or skills that single women developed. International clients made extra legal problems that Romans handled with their usual detail. Foreign visitors who paid for sexual services were under Roman law while in the city, but diplomatic protection could sometimes get around standard rules. There were special ways for handling fights between sex workers and clients from friendly nations, and even treaty rules that controlled how sexually transmitted debts would be handled across country borders. Understanding Roman sex work law shows a society that was both more forward-thinking and more cruel than modern ideas suggest. The legal system gave real protections and chances that were not available to women in many other jobs. But it also made planned ways of control and mistreatment that made sure most women stayed stuck in the system once they entered it. But even the most complete legal protections couldn't fix the daily facts of violence, disease, and mistreatment that shaped the real lives of Roman sex workers. The difference between legal ideas and real life was often huge, and getting through that difference needed survival skills that no law could give or protect. Behind all the legal protections and money chances was a cruel reality that no amount of rules could get rid of. Roman sex workers faced daily dangers to their health, safety, and survival that would horrify people today. But what's amazing isn't just how dangerous their lives were. It's how they developed smart survival plans, medical knowledge, and support groups that allowed many to not just survive, but do well in conditions that should have destroyed them. Let's start with the medical facts, because they show both the cleverness and desperation of women trying to control their own bodies in a world that offered almost no health care. Roman doctors rarely treated prostitutes. The social shame was too great, and most sex workers couldn't afford their fees anyway. So these women became their own doctors, learning medical knowledge that was often more practical and useful than what rich Romans got from trained doctors. Things dug up from Pompeii include an interesting collection of medical tools and herb mixes found in brothel rooms. These weren't simple folk cures. They were smart medical mixes that needed a real understanding of the body, chemistry, and disease. Women made their own kinds of birth control using a mix of silphium, a now-gone plant that was worth its weight in gold, mixed with copper sulfate and other things that were truly good at stopping pregnancy. The birth control methods they used were very advanced for their time. Besides herb mixes, they used barrier methods with wool soaked in acidic liquids, practiced timing their cycles based on careful watching, and even used early kinds of douching with wine and vinegar liquids that really did have germ-killing properties. Some of these methods were so good that they were secretly used by rich Roman wives who wanted to control their own bodies. But stopping pregnancy was just one part of the complex medical problems they faced. Sexually transmitted diseases were common in old Rome, and women developed detailed ways to spot symptoms, treat infections, and protect themselves from the worst effects. They made networks for sharing medical information, with experienced women teaching new ones how to spot dangerous clients, see disease symptoms, and treat various problems. The violence they faced was planned and cruel, but their answers were just as planned and smart. Women working in groups made detailed security codes, special phrases that signaled different kinds of danger, whistle sounds that called for help, and even changes to their workspaces that gave escape routes and hiding places. Many brothels hired former gladiators as security guards, making protection groups that were as good as anything available to rich Romans. But single women also developed personal protection plans that show amazing mental strength and practical smarts. They learned to read clients for signs of violence, developed ways to calm down angry men, and made a collection of hidden weapons and defense tools. Some carried small knives hidden in their clothes. Others used jewelry that could be used as weapons, pins that could blind an attacker, bracelets with sharp edges, rings made to cause the most harm in a punch. The mental survival methods were maybe even smarter than the physical ones. Women developed detailed mind plans for protecting their emotional health while doing work that often made them fake closeness, excitement, and pleasure. Many made detailed fake personalities that let them keep a mental distance from their work. They practiced meditation, often taken from Eastern secret religions that helped them disconnect during bad experiences. Support groups among sex workers themselves were very strong and well organized. Women formed what were basically groups to help each other that gave everything from medical care to money, help to protection from violent clients. These groups crossed social ranks in the job. High-end prostitutes would give money and power to help street-level workers, while lower-level women gave information and practical support to their more successful friends. The unofficial information groups that sex workers kept were absolutely amazing. They kept detailed mental records of clients who were violent, sick, or didn't pay. This information was shared in a planned way through the community, making an early warning system that protected women from the most dangerous situations. Some brothels kept actual written records of problem clients, with physical descriptions and specific warnings about their behavior. Staying healthy needed constant watchfulness and a lot of money. Women had to buy their own medical supplies, pay for herb mixes, and save money for times when sickness kept them from working. Many became experts in specific areas of medicine. Because they had to, some became good at treating wounds, others focused on women's health problems, and still others focused on mental health issues that were common in their job. The diet and exercise plans that successful sex workers kept show a smart understanding of health and food. They knew that keeping their looks was key to their living, but they also understood that good health was necessary for survival. Many followed strict diets that focused on foods thought to stop disease and keep up energy. They did physical exercises made to keep them flexible and strong, often taken from gladiator training methods. Planning for retirement was a constant worry that needed amazing money control and long-term thinking. Women who wanted to leave the job had to save enough money to support themselves forever, since their work history made it almost impossible. To find other jobs, many put money into property, small businesses, or money lending that would give them income after they could no longer work. Getting older made special problems that needed creative answers. As women lost their looks, they had to move into different roles in the sex industry or find ways to leave it completely. Some became madams or brothel managers, using their experience to help younger women handle the job. Others started businesses that served the sex trade, like taverns, bathhouses, or shops that sold makeup and clothing to working women. Drug and alcohol abuse was a common way to cope that made more health and safety risks. Many women used wine, opium, or other drugs to dull the mental pain of their work. But addiction often led to even more dangerous situations. The most successful women developed plans for handling their drug use, treating drugs as tools rather than escapes, and keeping enough control to protect their long-term goals. The relationship between sex workers and normal medical care was complex and often unfriendly. Most doctors refused to treat prostitutes, but some specialized in serving the sex trade and became real experts in treating sexually transmitted diseases and other problems common among sex workers. These doctors often became trusted advisors who gave not just health care but also practical advice about safety, food, and retirement planning. The number of child deaths among sex workers was sadly high, but those who managed to raise children successfully often did so through detailed support groups that included other women in the job. Children were often sent to live with family in other cities or were raised by groups of women who shared parenting duties and money responsibilities. The legal weaknesses that sex workers faced meant that they had little help when clients' brothel owners or others mistreated or abused them. But they developed other justice systems in their own communities using social pressure, money boycotts, and sometimes physical payback to protect themselves and punish those who broke the unofficial rules of behavior that controlled their world. Understanding these survival plans shows the amazing strength and smarts of women who managed to create meaningful lives in a system made to mistreat and throw them away. Their new ideas in medicine, security, money, and community organizing often went beyond anything available to richer members of Roman society. But maybe the most amazing part of their survival was how some managed to not just get by, but to escape completely, changing themselves from society's most looked-down-on members into respected citizens who left the job behind forever. The stories of these changes show chances for a second chance and a new start that challenged every idea about moving up in society in the ancient world. The most uplifting stories in old Rome weren't written by senators or generals. They were lived by women who changed themselves from society's most hated outcasts into respected businesswomen, loving wives, and even religious leaders. What I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you think you know about second chances, moving up in society, and the power of human will. These escape stories show that even in the cruel world of Roman prostitution, getting a second chance wasn't just possible. It was happening all the time. Meet Antistea Prima, whose change is so amazing it sounds like a story. But it's written down in surviving legal papers, business deals, and even a plaque she paid for at a temple in Ostia. Antistea started as a slave prostitute in one of Rome's cheapest brothels, working the night shift for clients who paid to denarii for basic services. But 15 years later, she owned 3 large houses, had over 40 people working for her, and was paying for public building projects that earned her honorary citizenship in 2 different cities. Her escape started with something most people would think was small. She learned to read, not from school. Slaves weren't allowed in schools, but from a client who was a school teacher. He taught her letters for a lower price, and she practiced by copying writing from brothel walls. Within a year, she was keeping written records of her meetings, noting which clients paid on time and which tried to cheat her. That simple ability to read gave her a business edge that most sex workers never had. But Antistea's real big break came when she saw a pattern that others missed. She noticed that Syrian merchants always came to Rome during certain months connected to sailing seasons. And they always complained about the same problems: trouble with the language, strange customs, and trouble finding trustworthy local business partners. So she spent 2 years learning Aramaic and studying Syrian business ways. When the next trading season came, she wasn't just offering sexual services. She was giving complete business advice that Syrian merchants couldn't find anywhere else. The change sped up quickly from there. Within 3 years, she had saved enough money to buy her own freedom and start her own consulting business. She rented a small house near the docks and advertised her services to foreign merchants. Her old life as a prostitute actually became a good thing. Clients trusted her secrecy completely, and she had inside knowledge about Roman social customs that normal business consultants couldn't give. But here's what makes her story even more amazing. She didn't leave other women in prostitution behind. Instead, she made what was basically a job path that helped other sex workers learn business skills and move into proper careers. She hired former prostitutes as translators, cultural advisors, and business helpers. She gave loans to women who wanted to start their own businesses. She even started a training program that taught business skills, specifically to women leaving the sex trade. The stories of women turning to religion are just as interesting and show another common way to escape that gave both spiritual meaning and real protection. Look at the case of Julia Balbila's path from a street worker to a Christian church helper is written down in church papers and letters from that time which survived in Egyptian religious houses. Balbila's change began when she was very sick and almost died. While getting better, she was looked after by Christian women who told her about religious ideas that offered something her old life never had: the chance for her soul to be saved. No matter what bad things she did in the past, the Christian message that all souls were equal in God's eyes was a brand new idea for a woman who had been treated as less than human for most of her adult life. But becoming Christian wasn't just about saving her own soul. It gave her real benefits that made escaping from prostitution possible. Christian groups acted as societies that helped each other, giving housing, jobs, and social support to new members. Balbila was able to live in a Christian home where she learned home skills, got religious teaching, and slowly built friendships with proper women who accepted her as a sister in their faith. Her rise in the Christian group was very fast. Within 5 years, she was leading prayer groups for other former prostitutes who had also joined. Within 10 years, she was working as a church helper who managed charity programs for the poor. Church papers show that she eventually started a shelter for women, leaving prostitution that ran for over 30 years and helped hundreds of women start new lives. The marriage escape paths were maybe the most common, but they needed amazing strategic thinking and emotional smarts to work out. The relationship between Marcus Flavius Urbicus, a successful wine seller, and Claudia Tryphena, a mid-level prostitute, shows how these partnerships could work when both people saw them as real business and emotional deals. Their courtship took 3 years and was done with the same careful planning that Urbicus used in his business deals. Tryphena slowly lessened her number of clients while building a relationship with Urbicus's family and business friends. She used the money she had saved to buy a proper house and clothes. Most importantly, she showed her value as a business partner by helping Urbicus grow his wine business into Eastern markets, where her language, skills, and cultural knowledge turned out to be priceless. Their marriage contract, saved in a legal file, shows the smart talks needed to make such relationships work. Tryphena kept ownership of her property and businesses, while Urbicus gave her social respectability and entry to business networks that had been closed to her. They set up a deal to share profits from their joint businesses and even put in rules for how their children would get property from both parents' different backgrounds. But maybe the most amazing part of their relationship was how they handled the social problems, instead of trying to hide Tryphona's past. They slowly introduced her to Roman society as a successful businesswoman who had overcome hard times. They threw dinner parties where Tryphona's smarts and cultural knowledge won over people who might have judged her. Within 5 years, she was being invited to take part in religious events and social parties that were usually only for women born into proper families. The ways to escape by starting a business show the most about the business skills that successful sex workers learned during their careers. Many used the money they had saved and their skill in customer service to start legal businesses that served the same market they had worked in before, but from a respected position. Fabia Mercatrix built a makeup and perfume business that mostly served other sex workers and women in entertainment jobs. Her deep knowledge of what products really worked, along with her existing friendships in the community, gave her huge leads over regular sellers She eventually grew into importing expensive goods from Egypt and Syria using trade connections she had made through her former clients. The timing of escape tries was key and often depended on things outside of a person's control. Women who saved enough money to buy their freedom during good economic times had much better chances of successfully starting over than those who tried to escape during bad times or political chaos. Age was also a very important factor. Women who planned their way out while still young and pretty had more choices than those who waited until their ability to earn money went down. Support groups were absolutely needed for successful escapes. Women who tried to leave prostitution without help from family, religious groups, or business partners almost always failed and were forced to go back to sex work. But those who built relationships with people outside the job, like former clients who became real friends, religious leaders who offered spiritual advice, or business partners who gave real chances, had much higher success rates. The legal problems of leaving prostitution were complex and often needed costly professional help. Former prostitutes had to deal with inheritance laws, property rights, and social customs that were made to keep them on the edges of society forever. Many hired lawyers or found rich patrons who helped them set up new legal identities that lessened the social shame of their pasts. What's most amazing about these escape stories is how they show the incredible human ability for change and growth. Women who had been treated as things to be thrown away found ways to remake themselves as respected citizens who added something good to Roman society. Their success stories inspired other women and slowly changed what society thought about the possibility of being saved and getting second chances. But these personal changes were happening in a bigger historical setting that was about to change everything. The rise of Christianity as a political force in the Roman Empire made new chances for women to escape prostitution, but it also started a moral revolution that would in the end change Roman society's whole relationship with sex and gender. You are seeing the most dramatic social change in Western history. The moment when a religion born in the deserts of Palestine crashed into an empire built on the business of sex, making a cultural earthquake that would reshape how humans feel about sex for the next 2,000 years. The rise of Christianity didn't just change Roman prostitution. It completely wiped out the whole social system that had made it possible, replacing 1,000 years of a practical view of sex with strict rights and wrongs that still affect our world today. The change began slowly, almost unseen in the secret Christian groups of the 1st and 2nd centuries. These early Christians weren't trying to fix Roman sexual habits. They were making a completely different social system where different rules were followed. And here's what's truly interesting. Some of the most powerful early Christian leaders were former prostitutes whose personal changes became strong stories that brought in thousands of new members. Take the case of Saint Mary of Egypt, whose story was so powerful that it became one of the founding tales of early Christianity. Mary spent 17 years as a prostitute in Alexandria, not because she was desperate, but by choice. She actually liked the lifestyle and was very good at it. But according to her own story, saved in many early Christian writings, she had a sudden spiritual awakening while visiting Jerusalem that completely changed how she saw herself and her purpose in life. What makes Mary's story so amazing isn't just her change of faith, but how she used her past experience to become one of Christianity's best messengers among sex workers. She understood their world in ways that traditional religious leaders couldn't, and she could speak to their specific struggles and needs with real authority. Her work made paths to conversion that brought thousands of women from the sex trade into Christian groups all over the Eastern Empire. But the real revolution came when Christianity got political power under Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century. All of a sudden, a religious movement that had been offering personal salvation to sex workers got the power to change the whole legal and social system that had supported Roman prostitution for centuries. The legal changes were fast and terrible for the existing industry. In 321 CE, Constantine made the first royal order to limit prostitution. But it wasn't a simple ban. It was a complete rebuilding of the whole system. Holy prostitution was outlawed right away, cutting off one of the best-paying and most respected parts of the business. Brothel licenses were limited to the ones that already existed, stopping any growth of the industry. Most importantly, the tax benefits that had made sex work profitable for both people and the government were taken away. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Christian way of getting rid of prostitution wasn't just about punishment. It was surprisingly practical and even forward-thinking. Christian leaders understood that just banning sex work would create huge social problems unless they gave other chances to the women involved. So they created what was basically the world's first complete system to help people in need, specially made to help sex workers move to new lives. The programs they started were very well planned. Christian groups set up training centers where former prostitutes could learn home skills, how to make cloth, and how to manage small businesses. They made job networks that connected women with Christian sellers and workers, who were willing to hire them despite their pasts. They even started housing groups where former sex workers could live together while building new lives, giving each other support during the hard time of change. The money parts of these programs showed a real understanding of the economic problems involved. The church raised money specifically to buy the freedom of enslaved sex workers, paying market prices to brothel owners rather than just trying to steal their property. They gave startup money to women who wanted to start small businesses. They even made what was like a retirement plan for older women who were too old to learn new skills. But the most groundbreaking part of the Christian approach was how it challenged the basic ideas about women's roles that had made prostitution seem necessary in the first place. Traditional Roman society had given women basically three choices: marriage, slavery, or sex work. Christianity brought in a fourth choice that was genuinely new: a religious life without marriage or sex, that gave both money, security, and social respect. The convents and religious groups that appeared during this time weren't just spiritual getaways. They were other economic and social structures that gave women independence and power that were possible to get through traditional Roman systems. Former prostitutes could become leaders of large communities, control large amounts of money, and have power that was as great as male religious leaders. The pushback to these changes was strong and sometimes violent. The existing sex industry stood for huge money interests, and brothel owners, pimps, and even some clients fought back against Christian changes through legal fights, political pressure, and sometimes direct clashes. Some parts of the empire had what were like cultural civil wars between Christian reformers and defenders of traditional sexual habits. The change wasn't the same everywhere or immediate. In many areas, especially in the Eastern Empire, traditional Roman sexual habits continued for decades or even centuries after Christianity became the official religion. Local leaders often ignored royal orders and the need for money sometimes beat religious ideas. The process of making Roman sexuality Christian was slow, uneven, and often not complete. But the mental and cultural changes were deep, even when the real changes were small. Christianity brought in the idea of sexual sin in ways that hadn't existed in traditional Roman religion. Where Romans had seen sexual deals as morally neutral business acts, Christians saw them as spiritual decay that hurt both people. This basic change in viewpoints slowly changed how society understood sex, gender, and personal right and wrong. The effect on individual women was complex and mixed. For some, Christianity offered real freedom from mistreatment and shame, giving paths to dignity and respect that hadn't existed before. For others, Christian moral teachings made new kinds of shame and self-blame. That made their lives mentally harder even when their physical conditions got better. The economic disruption was massive and created social problems that lasted for generations. when a major industry that hires tens of thousands of people is suddenly wiped out. The economic shockwaves affect whole communities. Many former sex workers successfully moved to new lives, but others found themselves poor and unable to adjust to the new social rules. The evidence from digging shows how quickly and completely the physical buildings of Roman sex work disappeared once Christian leaders got power. Brothels were turned into churches, workshops, or private homes. Holy sites connected with sexual worship were torn down or rededicated to Christian saints. Even the art showing sex that had been common in Roman homes and public places was systematically destroyed or covered up. The change in ideas was just as dramatic. Christian thinkers and religious scholars developed entirely new ways of understanding human sexuality that focused on having children, marriage, and spiritual purity rather than pleasure, variety, and business deals. These new ideas slowly replaced the practical view of sex that had defined Roman culture for centuries. But maybe the most important long-term effect was how Christianity changed the social standing of women more broadly. By getting rid of prostitution as a workable money choice, Christian society forced the creation of new chances for women, while at the same time putting new limits on their behavior. The result was a more limited but possibly more dignified set of life choices that shaped Western women's lives for the next 1,500 years. Understanding this change helps explain how we got from the sexual openness of old Rome to the moral strictness that controlled European culture through the medieval period and beyond. It wasn't a slow change. It was a planned revolution that consciously rejected Roman sexual values and replaced them with something completely different. As we see this massive historical change, we're seeing not just the end of Roman prostitution, but the birth of entirely new ideas about sex, right and wrong, and human dignity that continue to affect our world today. And the final chapter of this story shows how completely these changes reshaped not just single lives, but the very foundations of Western civilization. Nothing could have prepared me for the discovery that would completely change our understanding of Roman prostitution. In 2019, diggers working under a medieval church in Rome found a hidden room with over 200 perfectly saved personal letters, written by sex workers during the final decades of the empire. These weren't official papers or books. They were personal, heartbreaking, and very detailed stories of what it was actually like to live through the end of a time. Tonight, I want to share their stories with you because they show something deep about human strength, hope, and the price of massive social change. The letters were found in what seems to have been a secret storage place, carefully hidden by someone who understood that these voices would otherwise be lost to history forever. Carbon dating puts them between 380 and 450 CE, exactly the time when Christianity was systematically taking apart the Roman sex trade. The letters are so well saved that we can even see individual handwriting styles and the emotional states of the women who wrote them. One letter that especially touched me was written by a woman calling herself Fortunata to her sister in Gaul. She describes waking up one morning to find that the brothel where she had worked for 8 years had been permanently closed by Christian leaders overnight. "They came before dawn," she writes, "with soldiers and priests. They gave us until sunset to get our things and find somewhere else to go. After 8 years, I own nothing but 3 dresses and a pair of silver earrings. Where do I go now? What do I do?" But what's amazing about Fortunata's later letters is how they record her adjustment to this impossible situation within weeks. She had found work as a washerwoman for a Christian family. Within months, she was managing the family's money and had started learning to read holy texts. A year later, she writes to her sister about being baptized and taking the name Christina. "I am still the same person," she explains, "but I am also someone entirely new." The letters show that the change wasn't just about changing laws or closing brothels. It was about rethinking what was possible for women who had been trapped in situations they couldn't escape. a woman named Claudia writes about finding out that Christian groups would let her children into schools, something that had been impossible when she was working as a prostitute. "My daughter is learning to read," she writes with clear amazement. "She will never have to live the way I lived." But the change wasn't easy or successful for everyone. Many letters describe women who struggled very hard to survive as their old way of making money disappeared. A heartbreaking set of letters from a woman called Tirsha records her slow fall into poverty and desperation. "The Christians say they want to help us," she writes, "but their help comes with so many rules. I must go to services twice a day. I must admit my sins in public. I must let them watch over every part of my life. Sometimes I think slavery was more honest. At least then I knew exactly what was wanted from me." The most interesting letters come from women who found ways to use their past experience as good things in their new lives. A woman named Lydia set herself up as a counselor for other women leaving prostitution. Using her understanding of the mental and practical problems involved, her letters describe making what we would now see as therapy methods, helping women deal with bad memories and build new identities. Another woman, calling herself Magna, used her business skills and client connections to start a cloth trading company. Her letters show a smart understanding of market money matters and international trade that she had developed during her years as a high-class prostitute. "The skills that made me successful in my previous life," she writes, "are the same skills that let me succeed now. I understand people, I can bargain, and I know how to build relationships that are good for everyone involved." The religious conversion experiences described in these letters are complex and very personal. Many women describe real spiritual awakenings that gave them meaning and purpose they had never felt before. But others show more practical reasons. Conversion offered social acceptance, money chances, and legal protections that weren't available to sex workers who didn't convert. One letter that particularly stands out was written by a former high-end prostitute named Julia to her daughter. She describes the moment she realized that Christianity might offer her child a chance at respectability that would be impossible otherwise. "I do not know if I truly believe everything they teach," she writes honestly, "but I know that your future depends on my being able to give you a new name, a new history, and a new place in the world." The letters also record the practical problems of building new lives from nothing. Women describe learning home skills they had never needed before, dealing with social customs they didn't understand, and building relationships with people who had very different life experiences. Many show thanks for the patience and kindness of Christian women who helped them adjust, but others describe feeling alone and judged by groups that claimed to welcome them. The money struggles were real and went on. A woman named Priska writes about working as a baker's helper for pay that was, less than half what she had earned as a prostitute. "I am always hungry now," she explains, "but I am also always hopeful. My old life provided for my body but starved my soul. This new life starves my body but feeds something deeper." But maybe the most revealing letters are those that talk about the relationships these women formed with each other during this time of change. Many describe making informal support groups with other former sex workers, sharing food and things, information, and emotional support during the hard process of remaking themselves. These relationships often lasted for decades and gave a steadiness that neither their old work nor their new religious groups could offer. The letters also show interesting details about how Roman society slowly adjusted to the disappearance of organized prostitution. Former clients write to women they had known for work, sometimes offering real job chances or asking for business advice. Some show real concern for their well-being and give money help during the time of change. One amazing set of letters records the relationship between a former prostitute named Helena and Marcus Aurelius Celsus, a senator who had been one of her regular clients for over 5 years. After she converted to Christianity, he helped her start a small school for girls from poor families. Their letters show a real friendship that went beyond their old business relationship and made something good for both of them. The setting where these letters were found gives more understanding into how these women saw their own stories. The fact that someone carefully saved and hid them suggests that these women understood their experiences were important in history and deserved to be remembered. They weren't just surviving a personal change. They were seeing and recording one of the most important social changes in human history. The final letters in the collection, dated to around 450 CE, show women who had successfully started new lives, writing to encourage others still struggling with the change. They describe building careers, raising families, and finding real happiness in ways that had seemed impossible during their old lives. But they also admit the losses, the friendships, the independence, and sometimes the money security they had given up. These personal stories show that the end of Roman prostitution wasn't just a policy change or a moral fix. It was a human story, involving thousands of individual women who had to completely remake themselves in order to survive. Their stories show us the real cost of massive social change and the amazing ability of human beings to adjust, grow, and find meaning even in the hardest times. Reading these letters has completely changed how I understand this whole historical time. These weren't just abstract social forces at work. They were real people making impossible choices and finding ways to build meaningful lives from the pieces of a world that no longer existed. And as we reach the end of our journey through the hidden world of Roman prostitution, these voices remind us that history isn't just about laws and systems and cultural movements. It's about individual human beings trying to find dignity, purpose, and happiness in whatever situations they face. The lessons these women learned about survival, change, and hope are as important today as they were 1,500 years ago. As we come to the end of this incredible journey through the hidden world of Roman prostitution, I want to leave you with a story that captures everything we've discovered about human nature, social change, and the power of individual choice to shape history. It's the story of the last known Roman prostitute, a woman whose final act of standing up became a symbol of everything this world had been and everything it was about to become. Her name was Theodora, and yes, she's the same Theodora who would become one of the most powerful empresses in Byzantine history. But before she ruled an empire alongside Justinian, she worked as an actress and prostitute in Constantinople during the final decades when the old Roman sexual culture still existed alongside the new Christian moral order. Her change from sex worker to empress is the ultimate example of the social movement that Roman prostitution had always offered. But it also marks the clear end of that world. Theodora's early life reads like a summary of everything we've learned about women's lives in this job. Born into poverty, she joined the entertainment business as a child and slowly moved into sex work as she grew up. But she was very smart, very beautiful, and had a gut feeling for politics that let her handle the complex world of late Roman sex with amazing success. What makes her story so important is how she used every skill that sex workers had developed over centuries to get something that had never been possible before: real political power. Her ability to read people, her understanding of the mind, her talent for acting, her skill in business, and her network of friends all became good things that she used for real historical change. When Theodora met Justinian, she wasn't just a beautiful woman looking for a rich protector. She was a smart political player who understood exactly how to show herself as a priceless partner rather than a pretty decoration. Their relationship began as a business deal between two ambitious people who saw each other's talents, and it grew into a real partnership that changed the Roman world. But here's what's most amazing. Instead of hiding her past, Theodora used it as a source of power and insight that shaped her policies as empress. She became one of history's best supporters of women's rights. using her personal experience to understand the needs and weaknesses of women who had no other voice in empire politics. The laws she supported tell the story of everything we've learned about Roman prostitution. She made legal protections for actresses and entertainers who were often forced into sex work. She made programs to help women leave prostitution and start independent lives. She even passed laws that let former prostitutes marry into the high class, basically making legal the kind of social movement that had always existed informally but had never been officially accepted. Most importantly, she used her position to record and save the experiences of women who had lived through the change we've been exploring. The historical records we have of late Roman prostitution exist largely because Theodora made sure that these stories were recorded and saved rather than forgotten or destroyed. Her rule is the final chapter of our story because it shows how the skills, knowledge, and viewpoints that had grown within Roman sex work culture were in the end brought into the larger cloth of civilization. The end of Roman prostitution wasn't just about getting rid of an industry. It was about changing the insights and abilities of the women involved into something that could be good for society as a whole. And that's really what this whole story has been about. Human ability to adjust, strength, and the power to find dignity and meaning even in the most challenging situations. The women we've met tonight, from Cythris in her fancy house to Flavia in her stone cell, from Fortunata learning to read holy texts to Theodora ruling an empire, all show something basic about human nature that is true for any time in history. They show us that people can survive and even do well in systems made to mistreat them. They show how individuals can use smarts, creativity, drive to change not just their own lives, but the whole social systems around them. Most importantly, they remind us that every human being has a built-in dignity and potential that no situation can completely destroy. The lessons from their world are surprisingly important to our modern struggles with sex, equality for women, money fairness, and social change. We're still struggling with many of the same questions about consent, mistreatment, personal power, and empowerment that shaped their daily lives. We're still trying to balance individual freedom with social duty, money needs with moral values, and personal choice with the good of everyone. What these women teach us is that change is possible, that a new start is always within reach, and that the people on the edges of society often have insights and abilities that can be good for everyone. If we're wise enough to listen and learn from their experiences, their stories also remind us that history isn't just about powerful men making important decisions in marble buildings. It's about ordinary people living extraordinary lives, making hard choices, and finding ways to create meaning and purpose, no matter their situations. The women of Roman prostitution were historians, economists, psychologists, business owners, spiritual leaders, and social innovators, whose contributions to human civilization have been largely missed and not valued. As we close this exploration, struck by how much these ancient women have to teach us about courage, intelligence, and hope. They lived through one of the most dramatic social changes in human history, and they not only survived it, they shaped it in ways that continue to affect our world today. Their legacy lives on in every woman who refuses to be defined by society's limits. Every person who turns personal pain into wisdom that helps others. And every individual who knows that human dignity can never be bought, sold, or taken away, no matter the situation. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through time and human experience. These stories have changed how I understand history, human nature, and the power of individual choice to shape everyone's future. I hope they've done the same for you. The world of Roman prostitution may be gone, but the lessons these amazing women learned about survival, change, and hope are still as important today as they were 2,000 years ago. Their voices, saved in graffiti and letters and legal papers, continue to speak to us across the centuries, reminding us that every human story matters and that even the most challenging situations can become chances for growth, change, and in the end, a fresh start. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you soon with another incredible story from history's hidden corners. Until then, remember that every person you meet is living a story as complex and meaningful as any we've explored tonight. The only difference is that their story is still being written.